Would you like to go next?
My name is Shadia Dwedi, and I'm a project manager at PGE.
Thank you. Angela Long.
Hi, Angela Long with PGE. I'm our Senior Manager of Strategy and Planning.
Thank you. Seth Wiggins.
Morning, all. Seth Wiggins. I'm the manager of the Integrated Resource Planning team here at PGE.
Thank you. Abe Abdallah.
Abe Abdallah here, Senior Utility Analyst at the Oregon Public Utility Commission.
Thank you. Andy Iden.
Hi, Andy Iden. I'm an analyst on the DRP team at PGE.
Thank you. I've got Avery Dunn.
Hi, this is Avery Dunn with Yellowhead Development.
Thank you. Next, I think, is Eric Strid.
Hi, Eric Strid with Power Oregon.
Great. Thank you. Jake Stevens.
Jake Stevens, CEO, New Sun Energy.
Perfect. Next is Jeff Wood.
Jeff Wood with Cascade Renewable Transmission.
Thank you. It looks like might have had someone join. I'll come back to that. See if I can figure that out. Next up is Jennifer Hillhart. Maybe we'll come back to Jennifer. Kasia Brockman.
Yeah. Good morning, Kasia Brockman, Commission Advisor at the Public Utility Commission.
Thank you. Kim Herb.
Hi, Kim Herb, Utility Strategy and Planning Manager at Oregon PUC.
Thank you. I've got Jeff Larson.
Hi, Jeff Larson, representing Apex Clean Energy.
Thank you. Lauren Kerr. Maybe. Oh, Jennifer Hillhart's back, so why don't we go to you?
Hi, sorry, I went to get some coffee. This is Jennifer Hillhart, Policy Manager at Oregon Citizens Utility Board.
Great, thank you. Lauren Kerr, I'll go back to you. Maybe. Okay. Misty Gao.
Hi, good morning. This is Misty Gao. I'm an analyst from PGE.
Okay, thank you. Nihit Shah.
Everyone, good morning. My name is Nihit Shah. I am an analyst on the Integrated Resource Planning team. Thanks.
Thank you. Pat Shaughnessy. Is that how you say your last name?
It is. Nicely done. Yeah, good morning. This is Pat Shaughnessy with Energy Resource Planning Division at the Commission.
Thank you. Let's see. Next up, Rebecca Trujillo.
Good morning, Rebecca Trujillo. I am with Northwest Natural in the Regulatory Affairs Department. I'm a regulatory consultant.
Great. Thank you. Rainbow Wong.
Morning, everyone. I am on the IRP team at PGE.
Thank you. Rob Campbell.
Good morning, everyone. This is Rob Campbell. I'm an analyst on the IRP team at PGE.
Thanks. Next up, Sudesh Nepal.
Good morning. This is Sudesh Nepal. I'm a Senior Energy Policy Analyst in the Planning Division at PUC.
Thank you. Samantha Thompson.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Samantha Thompson, Energy Equity Partner on the Distribution Resource Planning team at PGE.
Thank you. Stefan Brown
Good morning, PG Regulatory Strategy.
and Tomas Morrissey.
Good morning. I'm an analyst on the IRP team at Portland General Electric.
Okay, thank you. So I want to check on Lauren because she is one of our presenters today and I want to make sure she has audio. Lauren, I cannot hear you. Can you maybe leave and then reconnect your audio to the meeting? And I'll back channel outside of this meeting to make sure we get that happen. So while Lauren does that, did anyone join us as I was going through there that I hadn't gotten a chance to introduce?
Yes, Craig Patterson, independent.
Welcome, thank you.
Yeah, this is Randy Hardy. I just joined.
Great, thank you. Okay, it looks like that might be everyone. Oh, Erin Apperson, would you like to introduce yourself? I think she's actually, oh, maybe. Okay, I think she might be in and out of this meeting, but Erin is with PGE. So, can you go to the next slide, Shadia? Okay, great. So the next two slides are kind of housekeeping slides about participation today. This is our meeting intention for the Roundtable series. It's about understanding our long-term resource needs and how we get to our action plan through the preferred portfolio. I'll pause here so you can all read it, and then we can move to the next slide in about 3 seconds. Okay. Go ahead and move on to the next slide. Thank you. So, sorry if I seem a little bit clunky. I am getting used to Zoom and where the chat and the participants all are. So I'm doing my best as we go through this today. So I'm going to talk about our meeting logistics for today's meeting. You'll notice that we are not on Teams today. We're on Zoom. One of the reasons that we're doing that is in an effort to be responsive to feedback about making our interactions more equitable during the meetings. So last time we tried to take comments via the chat, and it went okay, but it didn't get to the intent that we were looking for. So today we are not going to have the chat open for comments. We're going to take comments via the raised hand feature. So we will be, during the presentations, we'll take clarifying comments throughout when presenters are talking about their topic. You can raise hands and I'll call on you for the presenters to answer clarifying questions. If it's a comment or like a more detailed question, we're gonna save those to the end of the presentation, and there'll be time at the end of each presentation to talk to the presenter about their topic on those more detailed questions. And if we don't have time to get into detail about a question that you're interested in, we've put a link in the chat and on this form to our feedback form, and you can write to us there and describe your question, and we can have a back and forth about what you're interested in. So that's basically our participation today in a very brief explanation. Are there questions here before we move on? raise your hand if you have a question. Okay. Great. I guess one more thing is if you can see over in the chat that Shadia can send messages to you. And she has put in there the roundtable slides. You can go there and click on them and see them on your own screen, and you can look at the agenda at any time. There's also an acronym slide at the very end. I know that's helpful to some people, so you can pull that up and look at that throughout the presentation. If we have skipped over something, you can also raise your hand if you'd like to clarify an acronym, and we're happy to do that. And she has also put in the link to the stakeholder feedback form in the chat as well. So you can find that either on the slides or in our chat today. I don't see any hands raised. Shadia, am I missing any hands raised?
Nope, you're good to go. No hands raised.
Okay. And I'm gonna just check on Lauren Kerr's audio again because she is one of our presenters, and I want to do that before we move into our operating agreements. So Lauren, could you try to unmute?
Hi, Jesse, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can.
Okay, awesome.
Thank
I'm
you
Lauren
for doing
Kerr. Oh, sorry.
Okay.
Do you want an intro or?
Yeah.
I mean, I can just say, okay. Lauren Kerr, Senior Energy Analyst on the Renewable Initiatives team. I guess I was talking to a void earlier, but glad you all can hear me. Thanks,
Thank
Jesse.
you. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so we're gonna move to the next slide. And as I mentioned, Angela Long is here to talk about our operating agreements, and she'll be helping during facilitation of question and answer to enforce these operating agreements. So Angela, would you like to come on screen and just share a little bit about this?
Hi, thank you, Jesse, and good morning, everybody. Again, Angela Long, PG's Senior Manager of Strategy and Planning. A couple meetings ago, we heard feedback that it's really important for us to stay on schedule to continue to manage to the intent of this meeting and ensure that this is a space where everybody can participate. And as a result, we've implemented operating agreements that we hope allow this space in this meeting to be a productive dialogue and a place where we can all engage. And so we're asking today that everybody share airtime, that you should expect and accept non-closure. We will not be able to solve everything today. And I think that you'll see in our meeting that many of these conversations actually spanned over months. And so you'll see, we heard some feedback from the last meeting that the conversations we were having that day, there was some confusion on when they began and how they began. So we took that feedback and we've actually implemented in our slides content that kind of gives the history of where, how we got to where we've gotten. But part of this process is accepting that it is a long and evolving process sometimes. We ask that all of the feedback be constructive and to listen, to understand versus to respond. And we really want people to challenge ideas and not individuals. And so if you are okay with operating within these agreements, please give me a thumbs up so we know that this will be a productive, respectful place for everybody to participate. And you can do, if you're not familiar with Zoom, you can do thumbs up through the reactions on the bottom. So if you hover on the bottom of the screen, I see no thumbs up. So this is somewhat worrying me. All right.
I'm looking for my reactions too. Okay, so if you're not seeing it on the main menu, if you click the more buttons, there's a little reactions feature and you can do thumbs up or clapping or raise hand.
Right. The other thing, I guess, while we're waiting for, and if for some reason you're not able to use the reactions, feel free put it in the chat. The other thing we'd ask is that please share your organization in your name, and I can put instructions on how to do that. But if you hover over your name, you should be able to see 3 little dots. You can click on that and it'll say rename, and we encourage you to put your organization in there as well. We have a hand raised, Jesse.
Let me see. Jake, looks like you have a question.
Yeah, hi, thanks. So, obviously appreciate there's a lot of things that PGE and other stakeholders are trying to balance here. But I also want to be careful that we're not defining boundaries and conditions that, are counterproductive to the point of these meetings, right? Like this is part of the point of this process is not just for PGE to tell the world how they see things and what they're going to do, but to provide a forum for the critical analysis of the inputs and approaches that are being done. And I think, I see kind of an overlay here of things that are being discussed in frameworks and sort of, effectively in one form or another unilaterally overlaid on the process. And I would encourage all of us and other stakeholders, to realize that this is the only environment in which we get to discuss those and where experts actually have an opportunity to share in front of other stakeholders and flag issues. And we have seen that discussion, including, for example, the ability to discuss during individual slides and draw out issues that have been actually pretty problematic. I mean, the transmission issues, we appreciate there's been a multi-part, response to this, but several months ago, we had there's sort of blatantly erroneous platform that could have potentially been the means by which PGE moved forward. And it's important. It's important that the rules of engagement are not prohibitive of or suppressive of the important discussion among stakeholders.
Do you think anything that we have here, it prohibits you from doing that? Or are there, I mean, what I would ask is that if there's something specific with these operating agreements that you feel like limit your ability to provide feedback, then I'm interested in hearing that. And then we have a whole section on transmission that we can have a discussion about the inputs and how they get applied in the feedback that's received. But for these specific operating agreements, do you have concerns that they're going to limit you from being able to provide feedback and engage in this process?
I think that really depends on how it's moderated. So I think if these things become a tool to cut off, discussion that needs development, then they could be problematic. And that really depends on how it's moderated and whether, PGE uses it to that effect. I think we do need to be able to talk for the prior slide. Sorry, I couldn't jump in soon enough, but I think some of these things we do need to discuss during the slides and kind of get into specifics because there's a lot of details that deserve development and scrutiny. And so, I mean, in some cases, it may make sense to punt back a little bit, but I think it is important for us to be able to ask questions as we go. And if the answer is on the next slide and somebody wants to say, hey, can we hold that for a second? That makes a lot of sense. But
you provided that feedback last meeting and we took it to heart, Jake, and that's why Jessie, I don't know if you heard her earlier say she's going to allow people to raise hands and ask questions along the way. So hopefully we solve that that portion of your concern in this meeting, and then I'm interested in hearing feedback on how that worked now that we've adjusted and considered your feedback. But overall, you feel like the operating agreements are good. You can agree to those.
Like I said, a lot depends on how this is moderated. So I don't think, we're not going to comment definitively on that. Obviously, respect is important here. And I also encourage other stakeholders as they're thinking about the discussion. And, if anybody wants to nudge in, when I'm speaking and try to flag an idea, please do. And I'll try to pause as well. But this is one of the rare opportunities that stakeholders have to discuss things in front of each other because it was very time challenged for us to even be here, much less find time to have their separate discussions, et cetera. Thanks.
Yeah, the good points. And yes, we do want this to be a place where you can provide that feedback and be able to engage with us. So thank you for the comment, and hopefully we've addressed your comment around time and being able to answer and ask questions and seek clarification through the process. And Jessie, please provide Jessie and I feedback if we didn't address that in this meeting.
Thanks, Angela. So if we can move to the first topic. All right, so we're going to be talking about emissions forecasting. It's the second iteration of this topic. Tomas Morrissey will be presenting, and Shadia will be moving the slides for you, Tomas. So whenever you're ready, just go ahead and tell her that, and I will keep track of people that have their hands raised and let you know.
All right, Shadia, if you can hear me, please move to the next slide. Great, so today we're going to continue our discussion on emissions. We're going to start by reviewing briefly what we discussed in the November slide deck with a focus on the greenhouse gas emissions model. We're then going to take a look at, and at a high level, look at the historical usage of some PGE thermal units, as well as our other power plants. We'll then discuss thermal units in the 2023 IRP at a total level, and I'll explain what I mean by total level in a couple of slides, with an eye looking at reliability, wholesale revenue impacts, the changing Western interconnection, and carbon emissions and the greater Western interconnection. And then finally, one with a couple of slides looking at those total thermal unit modeling projections. Let's move to the next slide, please. So last meeting, we started by talking a bit about HB 2021 and the greenhouse gas targets set by HB 2021. And that's what's shown on the slide here. HB 2021 stipulates that PGE must reduce its greenhouse gas emissions 80% below the baseline by 2030, 90% below by 2035, and be carbon-free in 2040 and every year thereafter. And we report this through a reporting process that's been established with the Oregon DEQ. What you're seeing in the graph in the gray line on the left are historical emissions in million metric tons of greenhouse gases. These data come from Oregon DEQ. And then over on the right, you have in the three little orange kind of rectangles, our 2030 target, that 80% reduction, which translates to 1.62 million metric tons in 2030, then 0.81 million metric tons in 2035, and finally carbon-free in 2040. Let's go to the next slide, please. So at our last meeting, we talked a lot about the greenhouse gas emissions model, which is shown in the blue box in the center here. And that model takes some thermal input data out of Aurora. It also takes some actual data about market transactions. And it largely has two functions. One is it makes sure that we're meeting at a retail level our greenhouse gas glide path to 2030, and then the HB 2021 targets going forward. And it also ensures that we're taking wholesale market activity into account based on historical data. And one of the big outputs of that model is going to be the amount of retail energy associated with greenhouse gas emissions that we can retain in our IRP modeling. So today we're going to talk a little bit about that in the next slide, but the focus though is going to be more on that first part, which are those thermal input data that are mostly coming out of the Aurora model. All right, so this is a look at one of the big outputs of the greenhouse gas emissions model. I think we had this slide in November as well. And what this is showing is in the blue line, energy from GHG emitting sources that we're retaining to use to serve retail load. And in the orange line, it's showing metric tons of greenhouse gases that are associated with that energy. And you'll notice in 2030, we're hitting the 1.62 million metric ton target. And at the same time in 2030, we have about 4 million megawatt hours of energy that we're getting out of greenhouse gas associated sources. For context, today our retail load is probably in the ballpark of around 19 million megawatt hours. That's expected to grow over time. So by 2030, it will largely be larger. And in 2030, we're able to retain about 4 million megawatt hours from these GHG emitting sources. So that means the remainder has to be filled with carbon-free sources, either carbon-free sources that we own today or going to be acquiring in the next few years.
Tomas, Tomas, you have a question from Craig.
Great, go ahead.
Yes, yes, thank you. Tomas, do you have information on the specific places where the greenhouse gases are coming from? For example, the coal that's being phased out biomass, or natural gas? What is the mix of those three? And how does that relate to your graph? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a good question. It's a mix in this graph by 2030. It's mostly from our owned gas units. By 2030, we don't have any ownership in coal units anymore. So most of the emissions in 2030 come from our gas units. We do have some emissions in 2030 associated with unspecified market purchases. So if we buy a megawatt hour of power off the wholesale market and it's not tagged back to a specific source, it gets what's called an unspecified rate, which is today it's like 0.4, I think 28 tons a megawatt hour, which is kind of like a less efficient gas unit. But yeah, it's mostly gas in 2030. We'll have a look at a slide in I think 3 or 4 slides down the road that shows what the mix looked like in 2021. In 2021, we do have some coal in the mix, but by 2030, it's predominantly natural gas.
And I'm personally more interested in what is it today and what has it been, because projections are just that. They're projections. So what's the reality today? But I heard that you were going to address that. Thank you.
We'll see that on an energy level in a few slides, correct? Great. And one last note on the slide, I've been mentioning this is energy and emissions to serve retail load. HB 2021 is focused on retail load. So when we see those carbon targets from a few slides ago, those carbon targets apply to us serving our retail energy load. Let's go to the next slide, please. I think this is where my section ended last time, and it's going to be the last review slide of today. And it's a few key points in wholesale sales. So we're going to start to pivot to talk more about not how the plants run for retail load, but how the plants run in general. Before we get there, as I just mentioned, emissions associated with wholesale market sales are not subject to the GHG emission reduction target set by HB 2021. Additionally, though, they don't impact our need for greenhouse gas-free resources. So the graph you just saw that looks at retail load, that's really what's setting the amount of new carbon-free resources we need to acquire. Wholesale sales largely don't factor into that. Net power costs will likely change due to wholesale market activity. We're going to talk about that a little bit more later in this presentation. And also many wholesale market transactions are occurring with counterparties in carbon regulated markets like California and Washington. And we'll also talk about that a little bit later on in this presentation. So let's move on to our next slide. And Craig, hopefully these next 2 slides address your question. This is a map showing the coal and gas units that Portland General currently has a ownership interest in. I divide them in my brain into 3 chunks. We have our west side units in the Port Westward area. That's kind of by Clascanine, Oregon, if you're familiar with the Oregon coast, although not quite on the coast. And that's Power Plant Beaver, which is about 500 megawatts. Port Westward 1, which is a 400 megawatt combined cycle combustion turbine. And Port Westward 2, which is a 225 megawatt reciprocating engine facility. Going further east in the kind of Boardman/Hermiston area of Oregon, you have Carty, which is around 440 megawatts. It's a combined cycle combustion turbine. And same with Coyote, which is about 260 megawatts. And then further east, you have Colstrip units 3 and 4, of which PGE has a 20% ownership share. And that 20% share represents about 300 megawatts nameplate. And let's move to the next slide, please. All right, these data come out of our Form 10K, which is a financial filing we do every year. It's available online. And it's showing how we met both retail and wholesale loads in year 2021. And this is on an energy level. So in 2021, the system was about 37% natural gas, around 8% coal, 23% hydro, 15% wind and solar, and 17% other. So Craig, does that to some extent answer the question you had?
Well, I would like to know about the breakdown of other. How much of that is biomass?
That's a good question.
What are the other categories of other?
Yeah, other is I'm blanking on the exact percentage. It is in the 10K form, but it is mostly unspecified sources. So that's market purchases. There is a little bit of biomass in there, but it's not a very big percentage. The bulk of it, I want to say 80–90+% are market sales from unspecified sources. I'm sorry, market purchases from unspecified sources.
But Craig, we can, excuse me, Craig, we can follow up with you to get you the
Yeah.
exact data there too.
Thank you.
Thanks, Craig. And then Tomas, it looks like Jake has a question as well.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, hey, Tomas, thanks. And I think, well, I guess I'm guessing a lot of that other is effectively Bonneville Hydro or stuff that's not like explicitly from like a single hydro source versus generically market. I think for the Northwest that might help folks color that in. I don't know if the slides were supposed to be posted. I tried to find them so I could scroll ahead and see if I should hold my question. So I'm gonna ask, and maybe there is something coming up on this, but yes, HB 2021 is an emissions-based standard. I guess with the question on this slide, when you say retail plus wholesale, does wholesale mean power sales to third parties like non-load serving? Is that what that means?
That's correct. And we're going to be talking about total plant usage a lot today. And that's almost always going to be that case. It's serving our retail load plus wholesale sales.
Okay. So, and maybe you're going to have slides on this, but one of the things we've been keyed in on, and I think, it's been recognized in some of our conversations, Seth and I had a great breakout room discussion a few months ago now, maybe on this, but whether PGE is going to be reporting sort of all the emissions from all of its fossil plants as part of this, in the slides and reporting and discussion, as well as to sort of provide an overall backdrop. And I think there's two concerns we have generally that obviously it would be somewhat
Hey,
counterintuitive.
Jake, can I step in here? So we're allowing hand raising for clarifying questions about the specific presentation, and these additional substantive conversations are welcome and appreciated, but we want to do that after the presentation happens. So can I ask you to hold this longer question until after we get through the slides?
I guess the clarifying question is PGE going to be reporting and providing information on all of the emissions of these plants and their utilization?
Yeah, the final slide in this presentation has projections of our total plant utilization, both in energy and carbon emissions.
Okay,
and
thanks.
These are draft results right now. That information that you're asking about, Jake, will be provided in the IRP CEP filing at the end of March.
Well, and we're asking about it now because I think it's important in the pre-filing process to discuss it and understand what's going to be reported or not. So I do think some
understood that information will be available.
Okay, thank you. Jake, I've got a note here that you might have some comments during the question and answer period, but go ahead and raise your hand too when we get there. And if you don't have the slides, I just sent them to you to your personal email address, but they were emailed yesterday, and Shadia has also put them into the meeting chat. So if anyone else wants to flip through them, you can access them that way. Okay, go ahead, Tomas.
Great, let's move to the next slide. All right, so let's talk a bit about thermal plants and greenhouse gas emitting sources in the 2023 IRP. And again, today's conversation is more geared towards total plant utilization. So that's going to be the retail plus the wholesale sales aspect. And for the 2023 IRP, we're assuming that all plants are operating on economic dispatch. And what that means is when power prices are higher than variable costs, it signifies that either or PGE in the Greater West are in need of power of those plants, and the plants turn on and operate. Additionally, and we're going to walk through these 4 points in detail in the next bunch of slides, both PGE and the West are currently reliant on thermal plants for resource adequacy. Wholesale revenues can decrease net variable power costs. Electric power sales across the West are increasingly carbon regulated, either by tonnage or by carbon pricing. And altering gas plant dispatch will likely have no impact or slightly increase Western Interconnection GHG emissions. So let's move to the next slide. And again, we're going to walk through these 4 points. At the end, we're going to look at a graph that does show in our reference case the expected energy and emissions associated with all GHG sources in our draft modeling to date. We're going to start with reliability though. And this is a graph you've hopefully seen before. This is a snapshot of our draft seasonal capacity needs, with the orange colored line being summer and the more teal colored line being winter. What we're trying to call attention to is what's happening here between 2039 and 2040. And you're seeing an increase of around 1,800, 2,000 megawatts of capacity need. And that increase is almost entirely due to the assumption that we won't be able to use natural gas in our natural gas plants to serve retail load anymore. And without any other plans, that increases our capacity need at about a 1-to-1 ratio. So for every megawatt in this case, gas plant that we don't get to use for capacity, we see a 1 megawatt increase in capacity need. If we're able to alternatively fuel these plants, that step up would be muted somewhat, but this is our capacity snapshot where we don't assume any new supply side resources. So you see that big cliff there in 2040. Let's go ahead and move to the next slide. This is talking a bit more about west-wide reliability and really with a focus on trade between regions, which can also be a trade between balancing authorities and utilities. So WEC recently came out with a report last month about the state of the Western Interconnection and reliability risks in the Western Interconnection. And one of the items they highlighted is that the ability for different Western regions and utilities to trade power with one another is really important for reliability. There'll be some days where it's, say, really hot in California and they're having a tough time maintaining adequacy. And during those hours, typically there's a lot of power flowing north to south to help California maintain adequacy. And then sometimes in really cold winter events, I think we saw this in February, March 2019, you'll see power flowing south to north up into the northwest. Let's go ahead and move to the next slide, please. All right, this is touching a bit on wholesale market activities and its relation with the net variable power costs. This is also out of our Form 10K, which again, you can find online. It's an SEC filing. And in 2021, our wholesale revenues were around $255 million. And that was higher than our 2020 wholesale revenues, which were about $162 million. The main reason the wholesale revenues went up is due to higher market prices in 2021, as well as a little bit more market volume on our end. But what I want to call attention to is that table below. So this table below is discussing why our net variable power costs changed from year 2020 to 2021. And so our net variable power costs in the end of year 2020 are around 546 million. They went up a little bit for 2021. But what you'll notice, and we've highlighted in the red there, is that wholesale revenues are a negative value in this calculation. So wholesale revenues are helping reduce the net variable power costs. Let's go to the next slide, please. Great. So when we model how our thermal plants operate, we're modeling them in the context of the greater Western Interconnection. And this is showing the bulk of the Western Interconnection in this map. There's actually technically a bit of, I think Northern Baja's in there too, which is in the map. But what this is showing is all the different policies surrounding greenhouse gas emissions that we see across the West. So in Oregon, we have HB 2021, which pushes a 100% clean power system for retail by year 2040. In Washington and California, they have somewhat similar rules, as well as New Mexico, with a carbon-free date by 2045. There's some other areas like the BC province up to our north that has a 93% RPS, so it's a very clean power system. And there's also carbon pricing in some jurisdictions like Washington and California. So when we simulate our power plant usage in the Aurora model, it's taking all of these factors into consideration. And later on in the final slide, you'll notice in our reference case that our power plant utilization and the subsequent emissions are declining over time. And one of the big reasons they're declining are rules like HB 2021, which are pushing thousands of megawatts of renewables into the West over the next 20 years. For the IRP, we rely on a database from Wood Mackenzie, it's a consultancy, to build out the West. And in that database from 2022 through 2045, we're adding roughly 180,000 megawatts of solar, mostly utility solar, some of that is behind the meter, 70,000 megawatts of wind, and 70,000 megawatts of storage across the West. So again, later on, when you see the total plant utilization, and it's going downward in the reference case, all these new renewables are a big reason why. Let's move to the next slide, please. All right, so these last three slides, I'm going to talk a little bit about power plant dispatch and also power plant emission rates. So this is an example graph. Oh, looks like there's a question.
Hi, this is Sudeshna with PUC. In the previous graph, when you're talking about the Wood Mackenzie, data that you're using, so is that those, the volumes of renewables, those are like projections of what we would need to replace, the thermal power that we are losing is, and have they been like compared to other, comparable resources, like let's say with any demand, are there assumptions on, first of all, if those resources can be transferred, are there, is there infrastructure to do that, or what are some of the alternatives, are like, what are these projections, what kind of assumptions underlie these projections?
That's a good question. I don't know the answer to all that off the top of my head. I think a lot of the resource build forecasted by Wood Mackenzie is to meet rules like HB 2021. So like, SB 100 in California, CETA in Washington, and policies in other states. I would have to double check and might have to get back to you on more specifics though about like transmission assumptions in the Aurora model. I'm not sure how they're making those assumptions off the top of my head, and we'll have to get back to you. It's a really good question.
Okay, thank you.
But yeah, I'm not positive on that.
Yeah.
Then we have Jake, you have your hand raised for a question.
Yeah, it's kind of joined at the hip with that, but can you talk about what that means in terms of how you're using it in the model? I mean, is PGE presuming those things will exist as relates availability of things in the market and so forth? Like,
yes, for market availability, it's a bit different. So market availability is, oh, go ahead.
Yeah, how is that being used in terms of like affecting and displacing needs or power flows? Are you presuming something, like that? Okay, yeah, we're going to build lots of clean stuff. So how does that matter for PGE?
Yeah, it doesn't matter a ton for adequacy because our adequacy model isn't really linked to the WEC-wide model. Our adequacy model is more of like a PGE bubble with a market node that we can set. The Aurora model mostly gets used for power price forecasting and also forecasting, I think, revenues out of proxy resources. So, when farm gets built in 2025, what does it look like over the next X years? But it doesn't really play a big impact on the adequacy side. I think it's more on the pricing side.
So it's going to be used to forecast the prices in the market. I mean, essentially, Mike, it will assume that magically 70,000, whatever, 190 megs, 1,000 megs of solar will exist, and then you're going to assume that supply has therefore increased that much and therefore driven prices down ostensibly in a supply and demand, relationship, and therefore that's going to influence the economics being presumed by these things that will be hard to build and may not actually exist on any specific timeline. I guess that's what I'm getting to.
Yeah, by 2045, those are the new build numbers. We also see retirements in the model as well. I don't know the numbers off the top of my head, but a lot of thermal units, predominantly coal units, are retiring in that period as well. There's also load growth in the model. that soaks up some of that energy. But yeah, I mean, we buy the database from WoodMac, and it should be, it effectively takes into account the renewables needed to meet those policies in the future.
So it presumes that that supply will exist irrespective of the challenges of that occurring. And what, is there a curve schedule that shows what's going to exist where relative to how that flows into, I mean, if none of those exist till 2050 and it all gets caught up in 2045, that would be very different than if you assumed 1,000 megawatts a year for 10 years and then 5,000 megawatts, you know, like those, that curve shape matters a lot.
Yeah, I can't recall the rate at which the renewables arrive into the WAC. That's something we do have and can get back to you on.
And we've shared that in previous roundtable meetings as well.
Okay. Yeah, I guess just flagging that as a concern and whether it's realistic to assume in terms of how it affects what the model solves for. Thanks.
Thank you. Angus, you have a question?
Yeah, a comment and then a process question. The comment is that at least based on House Bill 2021, there has to be a ramp out of emissions of greenhouse gas emissions releasing resources, so that PGE is 80% free of them by 2030. Yeah. 90% by 2035 and 100% by 2040. Yeah, you don't get to those numbers by, you know, dropping all of your emitting resources in 2029. So I think, yeah, implicitly there is a ramp there, and it would be useful if PGE, you know, could acknowledge that and describe it. The process.
Angus, sorry to interrupt you, but can I just answer that question right now? That is covered in portfolio analysis. We will show that ramp with resource build out.
Good. Okay. Yeah, because I presume that, but other people watching this may not. The process suggestion is that this may go more smoothly if we try to put our questions into the chat box. I put 2 of them in there. And ask PGE to try to pick those questions up as they're proceeding through the presentation, rather than us, you know, interrupting the presentation on a regular basis.
Yeah, so we received both those questions and we're working to get answers for them right now. I think, yeah, as soon as we get them, we'll. I think it makes sense to read the answers to both of those questions to the group. But again, working to get the exact answer for you.
And that's fine. I just want the presentation to go maybe a little more smoothly if we're not constantly interrupting you.
Thanks, Angus.
Great.
All right.
We do have, I think, 5 slides to go, and then we'll have a bit more time for Q&A. So let's go through the next 3 slides. The next 3 slides are on both. Oh, sorry, let's go back one. We didn't have a chance to talk about it yet. Great. We're talking a little bit at a kind of theoretical level about power plant dispatch, and then we'll talk a bit about greenhouse gas intensity rates per power plant. So this is an example dispatch stack graph below. And the big item we're trying to discuss with this is that when power plants operate, they're typically operating off prices, and those prices are set by dynamic of demand and then also fuel prices. And what typically occurs is your lower variable cost resources, or your 0 variable cost resources, get utilized first. So at the near 0 cost end, you have wind and solar, to some extent hydro, and then to some extent nuclear as well. And those units, which are all carbon free, tend to get utilized first in the dispatch stack. After you've gone through those units, you tend to get to your higher variable cost resources. And that's largely coal plants, gas plants, and at the very far right, and really only used in emergency situations, oil units. Coal and gas can maybe flip-flop with each other in dispatch order depending on fuel prices. But typically by the time you're using a gas plant or a coal plant on the margin, you've exhausted your lower variable cost resources, which tend to be carbon free. Let's go to the next slide, please. I'll walk you through this graph. This is taking a look at the 6 thermal plants that Portland General Electric has an ownership stake in. On the left, those first three little pink lines that you see represent, and I'm not sure they're in this order, but they represent Carty, Coyote, and Port Westward 1. And those are newer combined cycle combustion turbine gas units. And they tend to have, relative to other thermal plants, a lower greenhouse gas emission rate. It's somewhere typically between 0.35 and 0.4 metric tons per megawatt hour. Moving to the right slightly, you have Beaver and Port Westward 2, and these tend to have somewhat higher greenhouse gas emission rates, probably close to 0.5 ton of carbon per megawatt hour. With gas plants, though, that emissions rate is directly tied to the amount of fuel consumes, and that's also tied back to prices. So typically, you'll see those three plants on the left, Carty, Coyote, and Port Westward 1, getting dispatched, being utilized before Beaver and Port Westward 2, as they can operate at a lower cost. And then finally, on the far right, we have Colstrip, which, like most coal plants, produces about a ton of carbon for every megawatt hour of power generated. One thing I'll note before we move on, this is ranking the plants by greenhouse gas intensity. It's not ranking them by dispatch order. Depending on fuel prices, Colstrip might be dispatching in the mix with or in front of many of these gas units. Let's go to the next slide, please. This is the same picture, but what we've done is we've filled in the rest of the graph for the remaining coal and gas plants in the Western Interconnection. And our big thinking on this graph, in conjunction with the past two, is with the gas units, if we were to limit their operations below what's economic, let's say we had Carty and we pulled back Carty's generation, what would happen in the moment is another plant, most likely gas and most likely less efficient, would ramp up to meet that reduced energy. And that would both be less efficient from a cost perspective and also have a slight increase from a carbon emission perspective. All right, let's go ahead and move to the next slide, please. All right, and sorry, really quick, my screen just got kind of strange. Can everyone still see the slides okay?
Yep.
I'm getting a thumbs up. All right. So we saw this graph earlier today. This is the amount of energy in blue and metric tons, associated metric tons of greenhouse gas emissions in red for serving retail load. And again, as a reminder, it's this retail load picture that's going to dictate the amount of new renewables we need to acquire for HB 2021. If we move to the next slide.
Tomas, could I interrupt you for 1 minute with a question?
Yeah.
I think it was from that last slide.
Yeah, let's go back one.
So Avery Dunn with Galehead is asking, are there retirement dates for the gas and coal plants to meet HB 2021?
I don't think we have any retirement dates for gas units in the IRP. There is the clean to coal bill that passed, I think in 2015-ish, that stipulates when PG has to be fully out of coal. I want to say that's the end of 2029. But for gas, what's happening here is we're using less of it going forward. So by the time we're in 2030, the amount of gas unit output that we're retaining is lower than it is in 2023. So it's more of a decrease in the amount of power we can retain for those units to serve retail load. It's not looking at gas unit retirements.
Thanks.
Great, so we can jump to the next slide. And this is, I think, the last slide with information on it. This is a look at our total greenhouse gas associated energy, and the blue line below, total greenhouse gas associated emissions. So total means retail plus wholesale. One thing to note on the emission side, in 2023, it's at around 8.6 million metric tons, and that's falling by about 5.6 million metric tons by 2035. And a big reason that's decreasing, and you'll see the associated energy is also decreasing at the same time, is what we talked about a few slides ago. We had that picture of the West. We're assuming in our West-wide model that there's a lot of renewables coming to the West, in the next 20 years. And all these renewables are pushing down market heat rates, which means it's becoming less economic for our gas units to dispatch into the market. So they run less often and our emissions are falling at a total level. This is from the RNRR case. And for those of you curious, this is effectively reference case assumptions without a carbon tax for Oregon that are getting pushed forward. So it's kind of like if you took all the Western policies in place today, including carbon pricing and the appropriate jurisdictions and the carbon-free policies, and you froze that and pushed it forward. That's what you're getting out of this graph, along with reference fuel and hydro conditions. And with that, I think we have a few minutes for questions.
Okay, thank you. So we have a couple hands up, and then Seth, if you have answers to John and Angus's question, go ahead and interrupt me when you get those. But I'll start with Elizabeth, and you can go ahead and unmute and ask your question.
Thanks. Can you turn to slide 17, please? My question is, you pointed out in 2040 that there's this big step up in the demand for energy other than the thermal. And I was wondering why there wasn't a comparable step up in 2030 when the biggest impact of House Bill 2021 comes on. It doesn't really show anything there.
Sorry, I was on mute. That's a good question. So what this graph is showing is our projected capacity needs. So how much additional resource do we need, or additional pure capacity do we need in these years to be resource adequate? In 2030, although we do have limitations to the amount of greenhouse gas related energy we can use, we still have a 1.62 million metric ton budget. And the assumption in our adequacy modeling is that we'll likely be spending that budget during hours of the year of highest need. So it doesn't impact your capacity picture. Starting in 2040, we have to go 100% carbon free.
Thomas, I'm so sorry, but I couldn't understand what you said. I mean, I heard the words, but I didn't understand what that meant. Are you saying that the thermal, are you saying that it could be sold out of state and offset what needs to happen in state, or
no?
What are you meaning about why? I mean, if you're going down by 80% and it's only going down by 90% in 2040, why aren't we feeling anything in 2030?
Yeah, so what's happening in 2030 is we are having a big, relative to today, a big decrease in where our carbon emissions need to be, but we're not losing our ability to utilize natural gas. And when we think about when we have our need for capacity, so our need for power plants, like trying to avoid having a blackout, that's typically going to happen only a select amount of hours per year, if that. So we're able to—
Can I check and see if I'm understanding you? So are you saying that in 2040, the bill means that you can't use thermal to fill a gap, and in 2030, you can use it? So only on the most extreme days, it's going to be filling in, but it can't fill in 2040.
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and that's just
Thank
for
you.
retail load, but yeah, that's exactly the takeaway.
Thanks.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Okay, Jake, you're up next. Jake Stevens.
Yeah, thanks. A couple of questions, I guess. Yeah, on that point, I mean, candidly, I think that the reliability exception requests may provide some flex there. And I think, you know, personally, we don't believe that the gas plant should be retired or removed from service. And so, you know, if we need a PUC rulemaking or something that sort of ensures that's, you know, better available to deal with well-defined emergency events, I think we would actually support that because of the cost and reliability consequences. I think conversely, I don't think we believe that the the sort of approach to continual progress here is adequate or reflecting the right shape of the curve here. And so one of the things we're struggling with is, I think, fundamentally, we believe that in order for the decarbonization to occur and to have reliability, dispatchability, capacity assets, that it is critical that the existing thermal units that the ratepayers have paid for are available to be integrating and providing reliability for the ratepayers. And they can't do that if they're contracted in the market and selling power and committed to selling power to third parties. I mean, if a unit's running 70 or 90% in the market, not serving load, as you guys achieve the appropriate reduction, then they're not available to provide reliability in emergency events. And so how are you guys going to model that and ensure that the ratepayers aren't having to buy an extra 3,000 megawatts of batteries to cover units that you're assuming in your model are going to be selling market power and so forth? And I guess related to that, we think it's pretty critical that the emissions for all market power sales are being made evident to everybody, so that we can both ensure that PG is not actually emitting more as a result of this clean energy law through market power sales, but also that there's a metric and measurability of the availability of those units to provide reliability to the customers as we increase renewables.
Yeah, it's an interesting question on the flexibility side. We are working with a consultancy, and I think she presented 2 months ago, and part of her scope of work is evaluating our flexibility needs in 26 and 2030. I agree that post 2030, that discussion probably becomes even more pertinent as we accumulate more and more renewable resources. And I appreciate the comment that it's, utilizing our existing resources to integrate those wind and solar projects. I don't have a specific answer for you, though, on exactly how that is functioning right now. That's hopefully something we can get back to you on, and we can dig into some of the work the consultancy has done and see if we can pull some insights out of that.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And I think your answer is fair, but I think the critical thing for stakeholders, the market, for regulators is there's no way to have a proper discussion around that without absolute transparency, disclosure, and reporting on the entire emissions packages and projection beyond just load service of every thermal unit. Like the world, everybody needs to see what's going on so we can have that discussion and not have actually blinders on relative to market power sales versus serving load, because it distorts things. And I mean, fundamentally, the ratepayers have paid for those assets to be available. They don't become non-valuable, obviously, by sitting there being off 90% of the year. They can be very, very valuable, and it radically will affect the amount of procurement, the amount of transmission, everything that's needed if they're presumed to be part of the solution set versus not, which I think ultimately—
Yeah, Jake, let me step in here. We have said today, before through the UM 2225 process, the data, the projections that we have for natural gas operation and thermal operation for both retail sales and the wholesale market will be made available. The projections for that will be out there. So we said that a couple times today.
And you're committed to reporting all
Yes, as required in UM 2225. And also because we think it's this is an integrated resource plan. This is part of the resource plan. That information of the projected usage of these thermal assets will be reported.
Projected and actual. I mean, the law doesn't currently say that,
IRP
right?
can't report
actuals
in the future, so we're going to report projections. The data is available for historical usage in a couple different places. And
I don't think you're currently required under DEQ or HB 2021 to report emissions above the load service level. So what we're asking for, and I think is required, is filling the gap in between load serving emissions reporting all the way through to 100% of actual utilization of the plants, and that be done. I don't think there's any way that there can be transparency, or the regulator can even weigh in on whether you're using these assets or the plans are appropriate if that is being hidden, which could be 70% of the plant's utilization, right?
Okay, I think we understand your comment. Let's move on. We have 5 more minutes of questions. And so looks like Craig, you have your hand up, and then I have a couple
This is Randy. This
questions
is
from the
Randy
chat.
Hardy. I have a question too.
Okay, Randy, you can, I'll hit you after Craig, and then I'll talk about a
Sure.
couple of questions that I have gotten directly. Thanks.
Yeah. Yes, thank you. It seems like most of the focus obviously is on decreasing emissions and on supply of how to counteract that. But I don't hear very much about demand. And I think that there are 3 points that I would like you to consider, 2 historical and 1 current. First of all, historically, when we look at BPA and the 70s and the projected shortfalls that got us into the whoops fiasco, we see that BPA raised their rates twice in the 70s, 74, 28%, and 79, 88%. By 82, Peter Johnson was declaring a surplus. And that is a market-driven effect of higher prices. The second historical piece is Texas, two winters ago. And when parasitic capitalism was able to charge, I believe it was $9,000 a megawatt. And then the third point is that historically we have the lowest rates in the country. So why would a wind farm or a solar farm sell energy to us when they could sell it to somebody else for twice the cost? You know, to me, these are 3 big areas that are not getting very much attention that desperately need it because they have huge implications.
So one thing we will be talking about in portfolio analysis, so I guess I'll back up a little bit more. In this graph here, we are assuming the reference case level of both energy efficiency and other demand side measures are embedded into these values. But in this IRP, we're also assessing additional energy efficiency measures. And we'll see that in the portfolio analysis, how those measures compete against each other and against other portfolios as well. So we are taking a look at increasing our levels of energy efficiency in this IRP.
But there's a caveat.
Oh, hi, Craig. This is Angela, and I'm sorry, I'm just jumping in to do a quick time check. We have 2 minutes left in this presentation and several questions we haven't got to. So maybe this be our last question that we take, and Jesse will probably have to respond to Angus and other directly through the chat to respond to their questions since we didn't get to those. But this will be our last question we take for this session. Go ahead, Craig. Sorry not to cut you off, but I just wanted to give that time check.
Okay. I just wanted to follow up that conservation, I've been involved in it for 40 years. And the fact that the results are projected or deemed and not verified at the end user meter is extraordinarily dubious. And nobody seems to want to address this. In my experience, and when the Power Planning Council says we've saved 7,000 megawatts over the years, and BPA says we've saved 2,357 megawatts, I believe, that discrepancy should give us extreme pause to realize that projected or deemed is a pig in the poke. And that we have to do better in order to really hang our hat on the realm of conservation. And I strongly believe in conservation to the nth degree. So I think we have to watch that as being a sacred cow that isn't sacred. Thank you.
Thank you, Craig. Yeah, this is an important consideration in this resource plan, and we've been talking about it in a couple different places in previous roundtables, and we'll continue to even in the later portfolio analysis section today, and then likely all portfolio analysis sections going forward. So appreciate the comments and Yeah, well, hopefully we will be addressing them sufficiently, going forward.
Okay, thanks all. So we're right on time to start our next topic. Randy, I'm going to send you an email real quick. I know that you're on the phone, so you can't type into the chat, but I'll be in communication with you to get your question if that's possible. And then I'll move us into this next topic.
Will those questions and answers be shared with others? We need to figure out how to set these agendas so we actually have time to discuss the whole topic. I still don't even understand what the glide path means. We weren't able to ask that question on the slide. So
we publish our answers to questions that people ask us in our monthly forms that are on the website. So yes, you will be able to see answers to those questions.
Can somebody explain where the glide path is coming from?
Let's move into the next topic, and I'll note down that question, Jake. Thanks.
Yeah, the net effect of cramming too much through is it suppresses the discussion around these issues and complicates the ability for the IRP meetings to be successful. So if you jamming too much in here and like we're getting to the end of every topic and there's still a lot that hasn't been discussed or basic things that aren't even understood by expert competent people, then please adjust the agenda approach. Thank you.
Are you recommending that we provide more time for these meetings, extend the amount of time we have?
I'm not commenting on the time block specifically for an individual meeting, but that, relative.
We have a lot of topics. Yeah, we have a lot of topics we have to cover. And so like, we want to make sure you have enough time to ask questions. So maybe we'll take that into consideration. And yes, we can, to answer your first question, Jesse, can we please post all the questions and the responses to the broader group as we respond to them?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, and I think just leaving some dynamic time in the agendas, so no, every agenda is not packed out. I mean, we clearly probably need an extra 20 minutes of slack in each of these meetings to have appropriate discussion. Thanks.
Okay, Nahit, I'm going to hand this off to you. Oh, sorry about that. And when you're ready, you can let Shadia know that you're ready to move to the next slide.
Thanks, Jesse. Good morning, everyone. I am Nahit Shah. I'm an analyst on the IRP team, and I will be providing an update on the community benefit indicators, or CBIs, as they are more popularly known as. So today, we're going to be discussing the 3 categories of CBIs that were defined in UM 2225. So the first category of CBI here is the resource CBIs. Resource CBIs effectively influence decisions in the resource build-out phase. So effectively within a single portfolio, when trying to meet energy capacity and flexibility needs, the capacity expansion model, ROSI, is trying to select different resource options. The RCBIs influence the costs and benefits associated with CBREs, which make them more competitive as an option to meet load and capacity needs. PCBIs is a metric that helps comparing one portfolio to another portfolio, or basically several portfolios. And the idea here is to provide a different dimension within the scoring of these portfolios so as to determine how community benefit should fit in. And finally, informational CBIs are going to be data-related CBIs that we provide that will not influence our decision-making in portfolio analysis necessarily, but will be an important talking point both through the filing and through the docket. So with each of these, I kind of want to jump into a little more detail. So sticking with the RCBIs here, so over the last few months, we've been talking about how we think about this benefit. And what we've realized is that these benefits don't accrue. They accrue at the project level. They don't accrue consistently across technology. And so you can have 2 projects that are the same technology that accrue different types of benefits. But the magnitude of the benefits could be the same, even though they're different types of benefits. And so in thinking through this process, what we have come up with is creating a construct within the IRP where we create sort of a CBRE favored approach where we reduce the cost of the CBRE by 10%. And we'll see the impact of this both on the next slide and in portfolio analysis that Rob will get into. So the idea here is to not try and define something that is so project specific, similar to our approach with some of the ITC tax credits for solar, batteries, and wind, some of the tax credits associated with the supply side resources, but to ensure that we are able to, from a planning standpoint, have a representative proxy that has a representative benefits of the combined impact of those elements that are being realized. On the portfolio CBI side, we are creating a generic benefit, with the same intent called community benefits. And the idea is that the community benefits scale with the megawatt additions of CBREs. So a portfolio that has more CBREs would have more community benefits and therefore would be rated appropriately. So the way you want to think about that is that there's a one-to-one relationship on a megawatt basis, right? So 100 megawatts of CBREs equals 100 units of community benefits on the portfolio scoring side, which is only compared to cost and variability, which we'll talk about a little later. Cost and risk, sorry, and which we'll talk about a little later. So with that framework in mind, let's dive a little deeper and visualize how like our CBIs work. So on this slide, what we are doing is that we have two resources, resource A and B. And so the goal here is that in capacity expansion, the model is trying to meet the needs, which are primarily driven by capacity, energy, and flexibility. And you'll see that capacity is one of the larger driving factors in the near term in this IRP. And so what the model will be trying to do is trying to pick a resource that provides a large amount of capacity at the least cost possible when it's trying to determine what is the least cost set of resources to pick. And so in this example, you can see that adding a 10% reduction in cost increases the CBI benefit to 15, as you can see on the right side of the chart here. And so the idea is that we are effectively saying that the combined benefit of community indicators is $15 per kW year. And that in effect is helping Rosie to pick or optimize with CBREs in mind. Now, the question whether the assumptions around this policy make sense can be answered a little more. And we have tested this through portfolio analysis. So later, Rob will talk through some of the different portfolios where we've tried to test different conditions, where we try to help the model optimize with CBREs and compare it to cases where there are no CBREs and when there are 100% CBREs. And you can see the difference, and you can see how this value is kind of representative in a sense. All right. With that in mind, I'm happy to move to the next slide and take questions on the CBIs.
Great. Thank you, Nahit. I don't see anyone with their hand raised, and I am not seeing any direct messages to me in the chat with questions. Shadia, am I missing anything?
I just saw three hands up. I think Elizabeth, Jake, and Greg.
Oh, thank you for pointing that out. Okay.
Elizabeth, would you like to go first, and then I'll go after you?
Thanks. I have a really basic question. I'm trying to understand how PGE interacts when they buy energy from third parties from solar. How does that compare with the CBRE? Is that considered a purchase from an outside party? Or is it more like when people have solar on their rooftops that's not counted how do these different sources of solar compare with each other?
Yeah, so if you're talking about costs, to a certain level, the IRP does not think about ownership in its modeling. So we don't necessarily say that this is from a third party or this is built by PGE as such. We want to calculate the costs holistically, and during the phase of procurement, we would decide what would be the best approach for customers when we think about what ownership model needs to exist. Does that answer your question?
Then why are you separating the CBREs from any other solar that you have? If you don't care how it's paid for?
Yeah,
who owns it?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really good point. So the CBRE was defined within the UM 2225, where the distinction between a CBRE and any other resource owned by someone else is that a CBRE has some form of community agreements with a community, right? So sort of a layer down from the ownership, there is some form of agreement with the community. Either they own part of it or they have some form of agreements to gain benefits from it, right? What those benefits are sort of project dependent, going back to sort of my earlier point. And so what we are doing here is effectively creating a space so that we are talking about the specifics around the CBREs, given that they will be providing those community benefits. And I'm happy to go into more detail about this. We did define CBREs, I think, in the November roundtable as well, and highlighted how it's slightly different from rooftop solar versus like QF solar and things like that. So happy to discuss that further as well if needed.
Okay, thank you, Elizabeth. Do you have a follow-up, or may I move on to Jake?
I don't want to take over, but why does PGE care about the community benefits? Is there something that drives it to caring about that?
Yes, it's the policy. It's a combination of like policies and how we think customers have asked for PGE to show up in different spaces, right? So it is in these conversations that we hear from community advocates that they would like more active investments in communities to maximize community benefits, and to figure out how we can create portfolios that balance community benefits with costs and risks. And so we are working towards that end as a combination of policy and that feedback.
And do you have a numerical value for the balance?
So how we balance between those elements will be something that we are working on, and will be something we will present in future roundtables as portfolio results like start become more apparent. Right. So we are at the draft stage of portfolio analysis. As we start refining those, we'll start getting more clear indications, and that will help us create a framework to balance the different pieces.
Thank you.
Okay, Jake.
Yeah, thanks. And Nahid, I think you explained that really well. I mean, I think the short version is that essentially there's a 10% kicker for the community benefit CBRI type projects and how they're going to be scored. So I have a kind of two-part question. Sort of what scale of projects will you be considering individually and in aggregate? Like, are you going to look at 200 kilowatt project? Are you guys going to look at doing 50 of those? Are you going to look at doing and will you explicitly be considering 10, 20, 50 megawatt projects relative to the statutory standard, which is anything that connects to transmission or distribution? So then I'll follow up after that. Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a good question. I think I think we touched on some of this in the last roundtable, so you can we can dive through some of those slides. But what I want to state is that in the IRP, we are looking at the potential of 3 proxy resources. That potential, and based on what is selected from that potential, will hopefully go through the process, and some of that will filter through the action plan. When it gets to the action plan, we will decide a way to procure those resources. And in that procurement, the rules will not be focused necessarily around the size as much as it will be primarily focused on maximizing community benefits, right? So while I think there will be rules to make sure that it's not overlapping with other procurement efforts, right? So if there is a program already in place at PGE to do X, we don't want to create a second procurement strategy to do X again, right? So we will make sure that we are kind of creating the right swim lane, but we wouldn't be limiting the project size on the IRP side. We are limiting it by the technical potential and then choosing it economically there. And so your question, I think, is downstream of this process.
But I don't think it is. I think it's fundamental to what the model's constrained to solve for, and fundamentally what the economics of those options that will flow through to the model. So you said 3 proxy resources. I mean, what does that mean? And explicitly, are you going to have any projects that have at scale economics? And my fundamental concern here to highlight this is, if we take solar and you can add batteries, to these numbers, but you could have a, multi-100 megawatt solar project that's built for $1 to $1.50 a watt, and you take that to 20 megawatts, and now you're $1.25, $1.50 a watt. I'm just kind of winging the numbers here, but to get the scale, you go to 10 megawatts and you add another 10 or 20 cents. You go to 3 megawatts, and now you got a $3 a watt project, and therefore the economics of that, when they flow through the rest of your model, that the 10% is not going to come close to offsetting. And then you go to a rooftop solar project and you've basically doubled the cost of the project. So I'm concerned that these community benefits are going to be inherently essentially destroyed as being viable in the modeling exercise by the constraints on the cost. And then the question is, so what are the specific projects, and what is the cost basis for those projects going to be? Because if those assumptions aren't correct, then this entire thing is going to be sabotaged from the beginning and result in nothing.
Absolutely. That is, I think you are, your logical connection makes sense. However, a couple of things. The project size and definition was discussed in the last meeting, and we can dive through that again. But your assumption that these would not be competitive is an assumption without seeing the results. We are going to share the results later in this presentation, and based on those results, you can determine if they have been artificially excluded or whatever. Right?
I don't think it's artificial. I think there's costs that come with scale. And that's why I'm asking for specific attributes of where are you going to get those costs from? And I'll give you an example. PGE's prior IRP in 2016 had a solar project in it that's been stuck with us in the models for the last 6 or 7 years that assumed a 1-month outage on a solar project that we couldn't even get transparency on what time of year the outage was presumed, never mind that solar projects don't take 1-month outages, that had a irrelevant DC to AC ratio of the project. It was fundamentally, costs that were radically over what would be assumed. So, where are these costs coming from? Are these going to be provided by Portland area solar installers and competitive, or and what scales are they going to be at? Because these are fundamental drivers to the entire modeling exercise.
So Nihit, can I jump in here
for
a second? Just because we're, I want to make space for other questions that we have. And I think, Jake, the point that you're making is a fair point in terms of the scale of resources and costs and the economics around these resources. And we do try to account for that in a variety of ways. And so I think in the whole, Nihit, the point you made regarding how we think about it in the modeling versus how we actually go out and procure it, they're 2 questions. So one thing you should know, Jake, is we are actually working with community to hear from them how best to define community benefit indicators through our learning labs, having them prioritize those indicators, and then also help us define how we go and procure those resources. So those efforts are happening directly with community, get their feedback in on that process, and hopefully.
Which is great, but the statute's the statute, right? So PGE saying we talk to people and they want a community, 200 kilowatt solar project doesn't change the fact that you're then going to flow it through the model at 200 kilowatts. And that literally will cost 100% more. And the 10% offset that Nahid just pointed out won't offset that. Like, that's unavoidable facts of the economics of distributed generation versus utility scale. And so PGE saying, because we talked to the community and they've got these ideas, doesn't mean it's statutorily compliant or not going to effectively shortchange all of those communities by preventing the viable economics of at-scale options. So I think stating very clearly,
Jake, I'm going to
model
interrupt you. And
doing
because I've heard a lot from you today, and I would encourage you to put this in writing in our stakeholder feedback form if you have a lot to say, but we do have other people waiting to ask their questions. And your questions are not the only questions that need to be answered in this meeting. So I'd like to move to the next person and
PG's
have you.
answer, to be clear though, is we're not telling you what the scale is going to be in these models.
No, that's not
Our
true.
answer-
That's fundamentally not true. Let me just stop in, Jesse. I don't mean to undermine the process, but Jake, that's we've spent a long time talking about this in the last meeting about the cost, size, availability constraints that are going into the model. If the economics are, as you say, that will be reflected in portfolio analysis. Full stop. That's all we need to say on this point, and we can just.
So you will have at scale, utility scale options.
You will have the options for CBRE resources with the CBIs applied to them, as we discussed in the last IRP meeting.
At economics at scale, like a 20 megawatt option for, I mean, that's compatible with the statute. So that's a economics, we can get the economics
I
economies of
think
scale.
we've answered what we're prepared to answer today, and I'm going to move on to the next person. But thank you for being involved. We'll take more of your questions and other topics. I have a question from Kara that came directly to me that I'd like to ask from the chat. And then Craig, I know that your hand is up. So Kara's question, Nahid, is how is PGE thinking about CBIs in the context of the supply side RFP?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I think the question around how we determine, so I think there are multiple sort of steps here, right? So the first step is figuring out how we put these in the model. Then the question is, how are the results panning out, and how are we translating those results into the action plan? And then from the action plan, how are we going to figure it out in procurement, right? And so I do want to kind of state that like some of that is a little downstream, and we will get to, and we will talk about that. But at this stage, I think the primary focus should be on how we are getting these inputs into the model. And so there has been discussion about creating a separate CBRE RFP, and we've discussed this in our learning labs. And so effectively, you can imagine, just a hypothetical action plan that has, let's say, 100, 150 megawatts of CBREs, and that could be its own action, which has its own RFP and its own procurement strategy that is focused on maximizing community benefits, right? That's not to say that that's exactly how it will pan out. That's an example. But the reason it's an example is because we're not there yet, and that's a little more downstream of where we are right now.
Thank you for that. So Craig, you have your hand up, and we have a few minutes to take your question. So would you like to go ahead?
Yes, thank you. I'd like to bring the discussion back down to earth and away from modeling for a minute and talk about community benefits and how it's seen from the ground up, and ask you, for example, how much of your community benefits and conservation efforts through Energy Trust and NIA and others goes to heat pumps, to people, to families that have resources that can spend out-of-pocket monies for that, versus how many people are living in substandard mobile homes, elderly and poor, who have to make the decision monthly about whether to buy food, medicine, electricity, or shelter. There's, when you look at the trends, I'm hearing that the trends are getting worse all the time relative to people having hard times paying their bills. And I've heard the number 20% more than once in that regard. So how does community benefits translate to the ground through your programs? Thank you.
Yeah, Craig, those are really important questions. I think that we can discuss those further, but I wonder if we should keep the space for sort of this discussion, and maybe there can be a panel conversation that happens. Seth, do you have any suggestions here?
Yeah, I would just say, I mean, pretty similar to what you just said, Nahid, that Craig, your question is absolutely appropriate for this discussion around HB 2021 implementation. So the rate pressure is real. And when we talk about community benefits, a large component of that is financial. And so there are oftentimes trade-offs between the benefits associated with say a CBRE or a CBI and total system cost. And so a full articulation and evaluation of those trade-offs is going to be important in this IRP and CEP, as well as really all of them going forward. And so I don't think we have much to add to that conversation, as we are trying to, focus specifically on the models and the 30,000 foot view that our models have to take. But I think it's a really good question. And I think it's going to be the subject of discussion in the industry between PGE, all our stakeholders, regulator, the state, all of that going forward. So appreciate the question. I don't have a great answer for you, and I don't think we can go the way you're hoping right now in terms of having that conversation now. But yeah, again, I think it's a good one and will need to happen. But I don't think this IRP forum where we are discussing the models is the appropriate place.
Yes, just to follow up briefly, if I may, my intention wasn't to necessarily do that, but to suggest that modeling has its place, but we need to ground it in historical trends. And if we don't, it's more hopium than reality.
Absolutely. I 100% agree. And I'm hopeful that, in this IRP roundtable and the ones coming, we are able to do that and have this better informed by the conversations that are happening. And an example of this is the feedback loop between our learning labs and the IRP roundtable. These conversations about CBREs and CBIs, we think there is useful iteration that's going on. So can the process be better? Absolutely. But I think we are making a serious attempt, and we've got a number of folks devoted to trying to figure out this issue. So again, appreciate the comment and the spirit of what you're saying.
Thank you. Thanks, Craig. I have one more question, but we only have 1 minute in the topic left. So Jennifer Hillhart, I'm going to send your question to Nahid directly and see if I can get you an answer back in the chat. And then we'll move to the next topic.
Thanks.
Yeah. Okay, so Rainbow is going to present to us on our price futures update. Rainbow, do you want to test your audio really quickly? I know we were troubleshooting with you.
Hi, can you all hear me?
Oh, we can now.
Hey, great. Okay. So hi, everyone. I am an analyst on the IRP team, and today I'm going to be giving you an update on the price features that's chosen for portfolio analysis. And move to the next slide. Here, the slide is to give you a recap of the roundtable presentations related to price feature selection We have gone to this group in July to present that we were going to be using 39 price futures for portfolio analysis. In the July portfolio set, we had 27 combinations of gas prices, carbon goal policy, and hydro conditions with WEC as the default build out. We also captured 3 futures which would consider uncertainties, so net load commitment errors as well as scarcity premium. 1 future that references gas and hydro conditions but had no additional carbon adder in WEC, and 8 additional price futures that would help align ROSI modeling requirements. If you move to the next slide. But since then, on top of the 39 price futures created, we actually created 24 additional price futures to reflect some price futures where carbon adders are not included in WEC. So as a result of that, there are 63 price futures that was created from July until now. And out of the 63 price futures, we have decided that we'll be using 42 price futures for portfolio analysis. And the reason for that is that we will use 42 price futures to maximize and optimize the scenario variety and for modeling processing time. So within the 42 price futures that we've chosen, we will continue to have combinations of gas price, carbon goals, policy, and hydro conditions with default WEC build out. Instead of 27, we will be having 18 combinations of that instead. We also added 9 combinations of gas prices where social cost is included. And then 9 additional price future combinations where no carbon adders is added in WEC. So this is an increase from 1 to 9. We also added 2 price futures with startup cost to reflect scarcity premium. And we added 1 price feature with net load commitment, which is signified by NNLH. We also then added 3 additional price features to align the hydro conditions requirement necessary for ROSI modeling. But in short, from July to now, the increase in the price futures as well as the selection for portfolio analysis allows us to have a much wider variety of scenarios that we test in portfolio analysis. And in the next chart, in the next slide, we'll see the graphs of all 63 price futures and to show that we've captured the widest range from the high end and the low end. So if you move on to the next slide. Ooh, okay. I was hoping that this is not going to be blurry. So here we are showing that with the 63 price futures graphed out here, we've really captured the high range, which is RSHL, when we look at the net variable power cost, as well as SNLH and NNLH, which is on the low end in green lines. And just to be sure that we are capturing all of these price features necessary for portfolio analysis, we looked at both the net variable power cost as well as the market purchases, so that we're capturing the full range of the price future scenarios. And with that, that is my update, and I'm open for questions.
Thank you, Rainbow. Oh, Craig, you have your hand up already. You're so fast. Okay. Craig, go ahead, and then Kasia, you have your hand up next. And I don't see anything in the chat, but Shadia, feel free to call my attention if I miss anything.
Yes, thank you. On the social costs, I'm curious as to what exactly those are and how do you determine value of those? How extensive is your work around social costs? And then also, in terms of the projections forward, to me, it's very difficult to see where the trends are. And if you went back in a graph 10, 20, 30 years relative to what's happening now, I think it would be clearer to us what the real picture is, because going from here forward without that reference, I think is highly dubious.
Thanks, Craig. Well, I guess maybe I'll first answer your second question as we pull up this slide. We don't necessarily look at the historical prices because one, we are using Wood Mackenzie's gas price forecast for the next 20 years to really take ourselves out of the equation so that we are not, cherry picking price features that is favorable to us. So we do tend to use a third party consultancy to provide that forecast. And their forecast is based on experts' opinions and looking at historical trends as well as what the trend looks like in the future, especially as they examine the trend of LNG, liquefied natural gas, and the growth in renewable energy, as well as policies. So a lot of different factors go into their forecast, but we do tend to lean on a third party independent consultancy so that we're not having a bias price feature forecast. And then back to your first question on social costs, I will have to get back to you on a very specific definition, but we do have a social cost in there that takes into account what we believe is a reasonable amount that's high enough to really represent the sort of the qualitative social cost to the community. And we also lean on Wood Mackenzie expertise on providing that number, but it is a 2.5% increase to the cost of prices in the social cost cases.
And just to follow up on that, I'm 95% sure we presented this at an earlier roundtable, and we will definitely follow up, excuse me, with the group on this, but 95% confident that the social cost numbers are coming from the EPA pre-Trump values that were estimated, I think, at the 2.5% discount rate. And so it's a dollar value associated with those calculations. But again, we can follow up as to what specifically the social cost numbers are.
Thank you. Let me go. I have a question from Kim that's a follow-up to that answer, and then Kasia, I'll call on you, okay? So Kim Herb from OPUC said, so social cost cases aren't the most recent SCGHG. Rainbow, are you able to answer that question? Or Seth?
Have to get back to you. I think we're still using the pre-Trump number, but yeah, let us check on that and we'll come back.
Okay, cool. So Kasia, go ahead.
Thanks, Rainbow. I'm sorry to ask this, but can you explain again on this slide the difference between 42 and 63 price futures? I think I missed the point of this.
Sure. So 63 price futures were what was created in the simulation software Aurora. But out of the 63 price features, as you can see here, there are some overlaps and within the range, if we're looking at the net variable power costs as well as the market purchases. So in order to optimize for modeling processing time for portfolio analysis and to make sure that we are capturing this wide range, we have chosen to use 42 price features for portfolio analysis instead of the full 63 price feature set.
Yeah, great. Thank you.
Okay, and I have a question from John Ollis.
Hello, can you hear me?
I can.
Oh, good. Sorry. Sometimes my headset gets cold in the morning. Yeah, thanks. I think I can even figure out how to put my hand down. Sorry, I'm not used to Zoom. Okay, so I had a question about the kind of the price future range, and I understand this is more thinking about, like, as you're taking these price futures and maybe putting them in your kind of capital expansion model or resource strategy model. But I did have a question a little bit about I just wanted to ask a little bit about the spread. So I'm having a little hard time, and maybe this is just the size of my screen. In general, would you represent that the no modeling input versus are having kind of like higher costs in general than the net load commitment error? Am I seeing that correctly? Do they have kind of a slightly higher range on some of the trajectories?
They do. So the no modeling input are represented in the blue line, and the net load commitment errors are represented in orange. And what's another interesting point about these two is that the net load commitment errors have a bit more of a jaggedy trend, as you can imagine, sort of what happens with commitment errors. But the no modeling inputs are generally slightly higher than the net load commitment errors.
I guess maybe I'm slightly misunderstanding the description. Is I tried to go back to the previous material on understanding these particular scenarios, and I just would have expected when you're accounting for commitment error to have slightly higher costs, but maybe I'm misunderstanding. Could you clarify on these scenarios? Just sorry if this is a review for other folks.
Not at all. So the net load commitment error is what we put in the model as choosing a random day each month of plus or minus 15%. And no modeling input would just be the electricity prices being run and simulated in Aurora without the plus or minus 15% error that we've randomly selected for each month. Does that answer your question?
I think so. So then maybe I'm misunderstanding. So this doesn't mean that commitment error causes lower costs, right?
It doesn't. It doesn't, but it does cause more of a, I don't know if I would want to use the word volatility, but you would definitely see more variability in the power cost in the net load commitment error scenarios as compared to the modeling input scenario.
Okay, thanks. I'll take the rest of my questions on this offline, but thanks for clarifying. Appreciate it.
Yeah, and thanks, John. And one more point about that, and it goes to a question you asked in the chat earlier about the resource build out. All of these price features are dependent on that forecast of resources coming online through the end of the planning horizon coming from WoodMac. And so we can follow up with you and anyone else who's interested for the roundtable slides that we were presenting. I think it was last fall, we were talking about when and where those resources are and resource types as well. So this is all going to be pretty extremely sensitive to those assumptions about resource locations and types.
Thanks, appreciate it.
All right, we are right on time to move to our next topic. Shadi, if you can put us at the topic slide. Thank you. Okay, so we're all the way in transmission part 4. We've presented on this 3 other times. Lauren Kerr will be presenting today. And Lauren, you can go ahead and start when you're ready, and Shadi will move the slides as you tell her to. Let's see. We might have lost your audio again. Let's test it. Can you mute and then unmute and see if we can hear you? Okay. It doesn't look like we can hear you. Let's see. Everyone just bear with me 1 second while I chat with.
Lauren, it looks like you came off mute. Would you mind testing the microphone?
Okay, so while we figure out this,
Oh, sorry, Seth.
while we
I was
figure
gonna,
out,
yeah,
okay,
I was gonna say the same thing you were gonna say. Go ahead.
okay, cool. Well, let me try to jump into this presentation. So I'll give you the poor man's version of it while Lauren works out the audio issues. So the point of this presentation is to go over the transmission options that are getting into ROSI. So in the past IRP meetings, we talked about a number of transmission topics that have led up to what's going into our portfolio analysis. So much of this is review, but we wanted to be very explicit about the assumptions going in, because they, as you'll see in our final section of the portfolio analysis today, the results of some initial modeling, these assumptions will drive a significant part of the portfolio analysis, as this is such a big topic. So if you go to the next slide, we just have some links that tell you when and where we've talked about this, this development of modeling, characterizing the existing system, and then looking abroad outside of the historical context, or the historical geographic area that we've looked at. And you know, when we look around, the main takeaway is that if you go to the next slide, the main takeaway is that something that, you know, we are all starting to recognize, that the BPA system upon which we depend heavily is where it's sort of the middle of the BPA donut. The inventory is limited, and upgrades are likely significant time period away, upwards of 10, 15, 20 years. And so for our 2030 problems, this won't 2030 opportunities, this is a challenge. And so we're trying to determine in this IRP and CEP the best way to effectively decarbonize while addressing these transmission constraints. Our plan would be significantly simpler if we didn't have this. I believe Lauren is able to jump in now. Lauren, are you here? Okay, I'm gonna keep going. Lauren, just interrupt me at any time you are able. So going to the next slide. This is a concept that we've talked about before many times in the IRP, is we use proxy resources. We don't use specific projects, a specific solar plant or a specific wind farm. Rather, we talk about these proxy resources, which give you the general flavor of what we can expect, hopefully, to find available on the market. And so again, we are within the BPA system, and so we're geographically located, surrounded by this BPA system, and so we are looking at 3 proxy transmission options right now. So the first one is the South of Alston upgrade. Potentially, if we can upgrade the South of Alston flow gate and the constraints surrounding that, then that would potentially free up BPA capacity. So resources that we would traditionally think are coming through BPA, we identify in our characterization of the existing system that those resources are not available. Say, imagine, Southwest Washington wind was this, perfect resource, non-emitting, 100% capacity factor, 100% ELCC. We're limited by the transmission capacity available in the existing system. This BPA proxy would allow us to select more of it. That's the point of it. And then also these additional transmission proxies, which again, we've talked about a couple times now, and off-system resources being looking towards the Southwest, where we think market access and desert Southwest solar is available, and then also to Wyoming, where we think a wind resource is available. Lauren, is that you?
Yeah, that's me. Can you hear me okay?
I can.
Okay, that was a journey, but thanks for presenting and thanks for bearing with me.
Of course.
Do you want to finish out this slide, or I can?
No, please jump in.
But okay, I was kind of multitasking, so apologies if anything is a bit repetitive. Yeah, and I think, Seth, you got it. Just wanted to highlight in this slide that PGE is on an island and historically has really relied on BPA system to deliver energy from off-system resources to our load. And so we're examining a couple of transmission proxies to provide directional, kind of a directional analysis and results, rather than something that's prescriptive. So we're looking into the South of Alston proxy, which is looking at upgrading South of Alston, which we have pre-existing rights on, and we're looking at upgrading so that we can access 400 megawatts of additional capacity. And then we're also looking at 2 different transmission proxies at this point, one in Wyoming, and then one would give us access to Desert Southwest. And if you could go to the next slide, we'll get into more detail on those.
Lauren, could I
and I'm not sure
interrupt? Could I interrupt you with a question really quick? I think it's clarifying.
Yep.
So Elizabeth wants to know our price futures scenarios.
Is
Does
that
that make-
for this presentation?
I think so. Elizabeth, do you want to hop on and clarify what you're asking?
Hey, Jesse, that question is going back to the last presentation. I can answer it really quick. So
okay, sorry.
The price features are, there's a discussion in the last IRP roundtable about how we're thinking about portfolio analysis and what's going into them. So we do consider them scenarios upon which the resource build out is performed. So they form sort of the distribution against which resources are constructed. And I'm going to delay any further conversation on this until the portfolio analysis section, which is coming up. So if your answer isn't fully answered, your question isn't fully answered by the end of Nihit's presentation after this, please do raise it again.
Okay. Sorry, Lauren, go ahead.
No worries at all. Thanks, Seth. So on this slide, we're giving a bit more detail into those various transmission proxies that we just went over. Essentially, we're modeling these scenarios as if we're building incremental transmission in our portfolio, where 1 megawatt of additional transmission capacity is equivalent to building 1 megawatt of a resource on the other side of the line. So in Desert Southwest, where the solar profile is known to be a bit stronger, we're looking at building 1 megawatt of solar on the other end, as well as Wyoming, We're assuming wind is what's being built on the other end of it. And then we're also assuming 6-hour battery will be built on the other side that we are the off taker of. And then we'll have access to the market as well in those hubs. So we're considering the transmission costs to build, the path to access these resources. We're looking into the resource and capacity costs, energy and capacity benefits, and those will all be evaluated in ROSI. And then for the south of Austin, we're looking at that 400 megawatt upgrade that would be available. We're targeting it would be available in the year 2027. However, permitting challenges arise, and there's so much that we can control. So that, of course, is subject to change. And for the south of Austin expansion, we're looking at that expansion as being able, or as enabling us to access IRP proxy resources that folks should be familiar with, as we've covered those in past IRPs and past roundtables. And that would be variable energy resources and non-emitting dispatchable resources as well.
We're talking about.
Is that a question or? Can you hear me okay?
We can hear
Yes.
you. I think that was just
Okay.
Unmutedness.
Okay, thanks. Could you move to the next slide, please? All right, so this is a slide that conveys how our modeling is set up in ROSI. ROSI is a least cost optimization model that's trying to answer the question of meeting both our forecasted energy and capacity needs in the future to meet PG's load. So we're answering the question, can we solve these forecasted needs based on a pre-existing 1,800 megawatts of available BPA long-term rights? And if we can, that's great. The model won't select to choose to upgrade the south of Austin proxy, and it also won't choose to reach beyond our more regional footprint out to those transmission proxies. But if those 1,800 megawatts are insufficient, the model will go ahead and have the option to access the south of Austin proxy to then access those IRP proxy resources. And if that's still insufficient, the model will go and select the transmission proxy resources. So as I said, this is a directional way to assess what our portfolio needs in a least cost way. And you can go to the next slide too.
I do have a question
so-
that is about this topic, if you don't mind me interrupting really quick.
Yep. Yeah, go
So
ahead.
Abe Abdallah from the PUC asked, does the model take into account transmission losses?
So as in line loss?
Abe, if you want to come off mute, does that line loss, does that meet your
Yes,
question?
I'll just, because you said it's a one megawatt for 1 megawatt. So just as a 1 megawatt of resource equal 1 megawatt of transmission, but there are some losses. So does the model have the losses embedded in there?
Yeah, that's a great question. So as considering transmission and the IRP is a newer concept for us that we're incorporating into the IRP for this upcoming filing. We're still sharpening our pencil and updating the modeling and reiterating. At this time, it hasn't been considered to my knowledge. Anyone from the IRP team can jump in and correct me, but to my knowledge, we're not considering it. However, that's something that we want to incorporate in the future.
Yeah,
But that's a great question.
Yeah, sorry, that's correct. I would just say that given that it doesn't, you can think of the costs that we're talking about applying to, whatever the megawatt value is divided by 1 minus those losses. So if we're talking about 100 megawatts, well, really 100 megawatts of benefit, then we're talking about 105 or 110 megawatts of line. Again, this is we're just getting models working at this point, and so this will be easy to implement and integrate going forward. But as of now, we don't.
Okay, thanks. So does that mean that the cost will be slightly higher because of those losses, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So you might be looking at a more optimistic view when we start showing these portfolio analysis results than what will show up at the end of March. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. Really quick, Lauren, I know this is I think this is your last slide, and we have a couple questions. So I want to give you a chance to finish the slide and then take these 2 questions from Kim and Sudeshna, and then we're going to move to the next topic.
Okay, yeah, it sounds great. Thanks, Seth. And as a clarification to the last question, in our other modeling efforts, line losses are accounted for, but Seth's answer was specific to transmission modeling. So the past few slides, if you were attending last month's IRP roundtable, should look really familiar. But this is the one slide where we're conveying some new information. So the quick summary of some inputs and outputs from Rosie at this time. We're looking at the regional hubs of Wyoming and Desert Southwest, where the cost to acquire that additional transmission capacity is right now looking between $20 and $23 per kW month. And we talked about the assumptions and limitations in that cost estimate last roundtable. And there's links in the beginning of this presentation if you want to refer to those and investigate that further. We based these costs on a study that was done a few years ago. We're happy to get feedback on if you feel like there's a different estimate that you would like to see us base this transmission cost assumption on. Happy to take a look at that, but we chose this publicly available source at this time. And then, so that's one of the inputs. The other outputs from the Rosie modeling is looking at the benefits per megawatt of available transmission. We're seeing Wyoming wind has typically a higher capacity factor. So we're seeing 0.44 megawatt average available per 1 megawatt of transmission, as well as a 1 megawatt of DLCC, and that's the estimated load carrying capability, a concept that's been covered pretty in depth in previous IRP roundtable discussions and previous IRP filings. And then in Southwest, Desert Southwest, we'll see a 0.32 megawatt average from solar, as well as the same 1 megawatt ELCC. And that 1 megawatt ELCC is not just a factor of those variable energy resources, it's a factor of being able to access dispatchable capacity as needed, as well as access to market liquidity. And we're doing further in-depth research into this. This is, again, our preliminary findings, and everything is in draft and potentially subject to change. But right now, the idea is Wyoming and Desert Southwest give us access to regional diversity where peak times are different, as well as they're like Wyoming's in a different time zone than Oregon. So there can be some benefits with being able to purchase energy at a time that's not peak in Wyoming, that could be a peak time in Oregon. So that's what we're really getting at here. And then regarding the available size and timing of these resources, in the Rosie modeling, we have a portfolio scenario that you see here called the default, or that can be thought of as the base case scenario, where Wyoming and Desert Southwest don't become available until 2031, where then they're unconstrained, so the model can build as much as it sees is necessary to meet our forecasted energy and capacity needs. And then we have a scenario specifically for Wyoming transmission, where 400 megawatts are available in our target year of 2026. Of course, operationally, that could always change. And then it becomes unconstrained, where the model can choose to build greater than 400 megawatts if it sees fit. And we have the same thing set up for the Desert Southwest transmission portfolio. And then we also have our energy value associated with that energy that comes from those various hubs to serve our load. And then for the south of Alston, because it is something that it's a little different than those other transmission proxies. So we're assuming that we're able to access those traditional IRP renewables. And we're also assuming the 400 megawatts in 2027. Of course, that's subject to change. And the energy values associated with the south of Alston upgrade are going to be the energy values that have been included in previous IRP, or they're subject to change, but it's a familiar concept that's been covered in previous IRPs and previous IRP roundtables.
Hey, Lauren.
So that, oh yeah, go ahead.
Can I ask you to pause? We got a number of hands right now on this slide.
Yep.
Thanks. Okay, so Kim, you had your hand up first, and then Sudeshna.
Thanks. I'm not sure whether this is going to be applicable from a modeling perspective, but I'm sort of trying to wrap my head around, some of the constraints that depend upon sort of ownership and who else is sort of using these lines. And I guess what I'm wondering, maybe the easiest way to ask it is like, does something like the nature of the contract affect the nature of the envisioned contract in these proxies, affect what the timing and availability of the resources? And specifically what I have in mind is like, is something like long-term firm versus conditional firm a variable that needs to be thought about when we're trying to do proxies for transmission? Or is that just, does that not really affect this?
No, I think that's a great question, and it definitely has an impact. Right now, as we're conducting like the preliminary analysis, we're going to make some simplifications and assumptions. The idea is that we have long-term firm access to these resources and would be the last in line to get curtailed. And that would certainly impact the ELCC. If you have conditional firm service, you're likely to not be able to get that energy home at those times when it's really needed. And that would definitely decrement the ELCC. It's definitely something that we can consider in future modeling. I'm not sure what we have in mind for our future scope, but that's a good call out.
Thank you.
Sudeshna, would you like to ask your question?
Sure. My first question is that, you mentioned historically you have, depended on BPA transmission. This time you're considering proxy transmission resources. So are these non-BPA resources that you have in mind for the proxies?
So the proxies aren't meant to call out any specific project or transmission owner or anything of that sort. We're looking to expand our footprint beyond where BPA service is. So I guess it's undetermined at this point. Not sure if anyone else from PG would want to take a stab at that question.
I think that
I'll
was
take that
good.
as no.
Yeah, I think that was
Okay.
good, Lauren. Yeah, I'll move on if that's okay, Sudeshna, or do you have a
Yeah, that's
follow-up?
fine. The other one I had was, have you considered, modeling a scenario where the proxy transmission resources are not available?
Yes,
To my
absolutely.
knowledge, oh, okay, go ahead.
Yes, certainly I've considered that. It is on the list of things to do. It's not pretty, but yes, we are going to do that.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thanks. Corey Coopersmith, I know you've had your hand up for a while. Why don't you go ahead?
Sure, thanks. I know PG in past meetings has mentioned the need for the last mile across BPA, and Randy Hardy brought it up in the last meeting about Cross Cascade South. I was wondering how PG is planning to track, if they are at all, the transmission kind of use or inventory need across that last mile as you look at, Wyoming wind or Meade or Montana, those resources need to get to Oregon and Washington, but then they also need to get to load.
I might let Seth take that question.
I'm sorry.
But,
Could you repeat the question, Corey?
Yeah, sure. The question is about just how the kind of inventory tracking or transmission need tracking is going to take place across that last mile constraint between BPA and PGE. Knowing that there's not identifying projects, but identifying kind of need for that inventory. And as you think about Wyoming wind or Meade solar or Montana wind, that's to get to Oregon and Washington, but then it also has to get back to load. So just kind of how PG is planning to track what that need is, and so we can understand how that matches to BPA projects or BPA inventories or other regional projects.
Yeah, absolutely. So this was part of the discussion in previous roundtables, and it's a hard question for us right now. So for context, this is as we're saying in the company, this is a new muscle for us to start flexing this evaluation of transmission, and we're really starting from the ground up as we consider these larger geographic area transmission options. And so just as the impacts of, say, the existing transmission system don't incorporate some like subgrid effects or other like nuances, that's the same, the last mile question of these transmissions, like projects, like how do you actually get them home to load, is still an open question as we're starting to look at it. So I really suspect that's not a satisfactory answer. We're working on how to think about what these transmission projects are and what they entail and what else they would require. But at this point, we're talking directional analysis that we are trying to, see if there are economic benefits from these, even if you just assume it's the line itself and you ignore everything else, right? And so better analysis would certainly incorporate the things that you're asking about, and we're doing the first step here, and hope to get to that later.
In the first step, do you think there'll at least be kind of understand there's a lot to dive through here, but at least like a tracking of it, just so kind of at least stakeholders are aware of how much these other resources are relying on that last mile, even if it's kind of ignored from a modeling perspective, that there's a quantity of last mile need associated with these proxies or these resources that the model's picking.
That's a really good question, to which I'm not qualified really to answer. There are folks within the company who would give a much better answer for that. So let us follow up with you on that. Because I think it's a really good question, and I think they have given a good answer to that. So let us follow up with you.
All right, thanks.
Yeah, this is Randy Hardy. Can I jump in here relevant to this, Seth?
Yes, but very quickly, we're trying to end this section. We're a little bit behind on time, so we're trying to end it in the next couple of minutes. So please.
I understand. Let me just make a statement. You've got the last mile issue, and you have a bunch of stuff, mainly Portland area subgrid stuff, that's currently under negotiation with Bonneville and PGE. That's beyond the 1,800 megawatts you've identified, and that's not trivial. It's probably 500 to 1,000 megawatts at least that's potentially enabled that would help the last mile problem, but it also might enable you to access other Western Washington, Western Oregon, Eastern Washington, Eastern Oregon resources that would be cheaper than your Wyoming stuff. And at some point, you need to look at that side by side with the delivery costs of the Oregon or of Montana, Wyoming, desert Southwest stuff. And so you got a couple of gigawatts of potential additional transmission that just isn't here yet for you to evaluate. So you're off chasing Wyoming wind and others, which may be the right choice, but it's done in absence of what you might actually get out of the negotiations with Bonneville in another 6 months. And so I assume you're going to plan to incorporate that at some point, but you got another whole issue out there that potentially could materialize that would dramatically affect your whole IRP that just isn't in here.
Yeah, I appreciate the comment. Like I said before, this is supposed to be a high-level directional analysis new to the IRP, so there will be certain components of it that are insufficient from a practicality standpoint, and that's true with all of our analysis. It's all a very high-level view of it. We will try to incorporate as much as we can into that process, and again, the experts would weigh in better than I can right now as to the viability and the applicability of that potential option into our model. So I'm just gonna cut that off. Just gonna cut that off here, and totally appreciate the comment, and we will be considering it.
Okay, so I'm going to move us to the next topic. Jeff Wood and Jeff Larson, I have taken your questions that you sent to me and passed them along. So we will be responding to you and let you know the answer to those if we can. And I will pass it off to Nahit to talk about our portfolio scoring metrics. Nahit, go ahead and take over. And as usual, Shadia will move the slides for you.
Thank you again, Jesse. Hello again, everyone. My name is Nahit Shah. In this section, we're going to talk about the metrics associated with portfolio scoring. So just to make sure everybody's on the same page, I want to show a slide from the November roundtable. So we kind of showed this slide, where we talked through, we defined all the elements within the slide and also talked through the fact that there is a process to defining several portfolios and then filtering from several portfolios to the preferred portfolio, and that process includes portfolio scoring. And so while portfolio scoring itself is a process, our focus today is on the metrics within portfolio scoring, right? So there are kind of two elements. First, what are the metrics, and then how are we balancing those metrics? And so we're going to talk about the metrics today, and we'll talk about how we are going to compare those metrics in the future, in future roundtables as we get through some of these topics, right? So with that, we can move to the next slide. So in this IRP and CEP, our approach to scoring is going to be broadly in sort of two categories, right? So the IRP historical requirements around cost and risk are captured in the traditional metrics, and the risk is broken out into two pieces. There is the variability and the severity risk. And then in addition to these traditional metrics, as a function of UM 2225 and all the feedback that we've received from stakeholders, we are creating the PCBIs, which are community benefits, which I talked about a little earlier, right? And so these four metrics form the fundamental basis to decide which portfolio should be preferred, right? And in addition to this, there will obviously be some subjective discussion that happens as well, but these are the primary metrics along which we will be evaluating every single portfolio. And so with that, let's dive into each of these. So on the next slide here, we are starting with the first two metrics of cost. So the way we define cost is we focus on the present value of all the costs and benefits, so the net present value of the revenue requirement through the planning horizon, right? And so in effect, we are accounting for all IRP costs and benefits, including the RCBIs, fixed cost, variable cost, capacity value, flexibility value, energy value, integration costs, what have you. All of those costs and benefits are accounted for within ROSI as it's trying to optimize for least cost, and the net present value of that revenue requirement is calculated as the cost metric. On the risk side, we start with variability. The metric within variability that we use, the calculation, is called the semi-deviation of the net present value of revenue requirement. So the semi-deviation is effectively a measure of dispersion. So you want to look at how the net present value of revenue requirement, or the NPVRR, is changing across different futures, especially for futures, only for futures that are more expensive than the reference case, right? And so that tells you that given that there is a reference case cost, how much variability can we expect above the reference case cost in that portfolio design, right? And so that's kind of the goal of the variability metric and the semi-deviation that we use to calculate it. With that in mind, I think we can move to the next set of definitions here on the next slide, which is the other risk metric, severity. The severity is calculated through the tailvar 90. And what this effectively means is that we want to calculate the worst 10% of NPVRRs across all futures, right? So there are definitely some futures, they might be associated with high need, low hydro conditions, different price futures as well, that lead to higher costs on aggregate. And we want to look at the worst 10% of that and use that as a way to determine what's our worst case risk, effectively. And that's how we think about severity. And so in combination with these risk metrics and the cost metric, we have the community benefit metric, which, as I defined earlier today, it's effectively representing the aggregate impact of community benefits associated with CBRE additions. And they are calculated on a one-to-one basis, scaling with megawatts, right? So one community benefit unit is equal to 1 megawatt of CBREs, right? And so today's goal is largely to define these units and have everyone get comfortable with them, because these are the ones that will effectively be used and will be talked about over and over again as we go through the next section. And so that's kind of the primary goal here. And in the next section, Rob will go through some of the draft analyses, and you will see some of these terms kind of show up. Again, we've defined these terms today, and we'll go through the process and be able to calculate these and tweak the calculation as we move forward. But this is how we define them at sort of a high level. With that, we can move to the next slide, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thanks, Nahit. It looks like Angus has a question in the chat. Is it okay if I read it to you?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. If a resource is not available due to transmission limitations, but otherwise would score attractively on cost, how is the combined cost/possibility shape of this resource assessed? Parentheses. Thus, a Montana wind resource that can only be accessed via a BPA link that is presently not available or constrained? Question mark.
Yeah, that's a good question, and I think Seth kind of was painting sort of an extreme example of this earlier, where effectively, if a resource is beyond reach, right, due to some constraint, then the model doesn't have an ability to select the resource, and so it doesn't matter if it was the cheapest, most optimized resource available. If there isn't a way to get it to the system, that becomes a hard constraint. So the transmission constraints are hard constraints in a sense. There's no flexibility saying that, oh, there is a really cheap resource, so maybe we can figure out how to build transmission to a magical resource. So the model is based on transmission constraints, right? So we assume the transmission constraints will define the solution set needs to be assuming the transmission constraints hold. So you wouldn't be able to access that resource in short.
That's it. I would add to that answer that's definitely correct. Though it could be interesting to look at the value of the relaxation of that constraint. It's called in technical terms, that's called the shadow price of a constraint in a linear optimization model or any sort of an optimization model. And if it's of interest, we can start looking at shadow prices for different resources. Now, we have heard and we've responded to interest to sort of seeing call it the shadow price of the entire transmission system. So if you just removed everything of the transmission system in portfolio analysis, at least, what would be the reduction in costs associated with that? It's unrealistic, it's unactionable. PGE can't do that, but it could be interesting to see, does it reduce costs by 10%, by 50%? What's the order of magnitude there? That is an interesting question, and we looked at that. But if there is interest in looking at specific resource shadow prices, we could also go down that path of analysis.
Okay, Angus, feel free to chat me back. Let me know if you have follow-up. I've got a hand raised from Craig. So we have a few more minutes. Go ahead.
Yes, thank you. The question of transmission begs the question of centralized versus decentralized resources. And I wonder how your modeling is addressing that. What is your current mix of centralized versus decentralized resources? And how are you addressing the questions of reliability relative to those two paths, particularly given that we're in a non-linear reality today, with 100-degree temperatures in the Arctic, we're the non-linear aspects of the future are very much unknown. So how are we taking all of those considerations into the modeling arena?
Yeah, Greg, I'm happy to get into this, and I want to note that we've talked about our capacity modeling and the fact that it creates it has this randomization to it, right? And so in that randomization, we do account for different types of weather years, including the 2021 weather year where we had the heat dome event. And several, weather years going back, I think about 30 years, that have had increasing temperature conditions and different types of weather conditions. In addition to that, we also have some gradual warming in our load forecast that we've accounted for. And we've talked in depth about the climate change impacts on the electricity system. We had a consultant, CRS, talk about this for, I think, about an hour a couple of times ago. So happy to rehash some of that as needed. To your question about the demand side versus supply side, we are trying to incorporate as much demand side as we can. We have incorporated everything from Energy Trust. We have incorporated everything from our distribution system plan. We have also now worked with stakeholders to develop the CBREs. And at this point, we think that we have adequately covered all demand side options. And they have, in a lot of ways, are competing on equal ground with the supply side options. And while I think your previous thought on central versus decentralized is relevant, I think you made the point. The question is really about reliability, right? And so if you have a lot of decentralized resources that are subject to the same weather pattern, for example, like today, where it isn't as windy and it's quite cold. If all your wind was located in one area, you would have a lot of risk associated with that. And so when trying to optimize for these things, we do take into account the different capacity contributions of all these resources and what would be the optimal mix. So while I can't necessarily provide the details of any single specific element, all of those elements and their aggregate impacts are accounted for to the best of my knowledge. Does that answer your question?
Somewhat. Yeah, but I appreciate your effort for sure. And
Thank you.
I don't need to follow up at this time.
Okay,
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks, Craig. Let's see. So we're right on time to move to our next topic. Although I do see that Jake, you do have your hand up. Do you have a question that's quick, or are you hoping to make a point?
I'm not sure how to answer that, but the answer to Angus a second ago, I guess I'm just trying to wrap my head around like the transmission constraints or unconstrained aspects of that, and how that's. I mean, I see your slide saying that it's going to be unconstrained for Wyoming and the desert Southwest, and I guess I don't understand what the basis of that is, and how that's going to function. You know, like it seems to imply that there's unlimited transmission available to Portland from Wyoming, and so understanding what the basis of that is before that's accounted for in the model and it's allowed to kind of, as was being described, solve for that and select for those cases. Seth was talking about the shadow prices, but I'm not even sure we understand how the current assumptions are working, or how those shadow prices would then, I guess, account for the actual CapEx and other things related to that. So it seems.
Okay.
Yeah.
Let me talk to Seth and see if we can follow up with you in a little bit, either in this meeting if that's the right space, or afterwards. But we can.
I think it comes up a little bit more in the slides later, but yeah, I think drilling into that a little bit more relative to assumption viability would be appreciated. Thanks.
Thanks. So Shadia, would you move us to the next topic slide? Thank you. Okay, so our last topic for today is about our draft portfolio results. Rob Campbell is going to be presenting on this. It's building on some of the information that he talked about in November. And Rob, whenever you're ready, you can go ahead, and Shadia will move the slides for you.
Thanks, Jesse. Yeah, hi everyone. I'm Rob Campbell, an analyst on the IRP team. And yeah, if we can move to the next slide, we'll get started talking about portfolio analysis. So the way we'll flow through this portion of the presentation today is we'll start with a review of November's portfolio presentation that was actually given by Nahit, but we'll just revisit some of that to kind of refresh our memory on where we are with some portfolio construction assumptions and principles that were used for constructing portfolios, and review the portfolios that we've designed that we're currently working on modeling. Then we'll review some data vintages, energy and capacity need, and key assumptions that are being used currently to produce these draft results that we're going to be presenting. And then third, we'll get to actually looking at some of the draft portfolio results, with the idea today that, yeah, we're looking at draft results. So a lot of things here are still in flux, still being nailed down, data vintages still to be updated throughout the next few months, and probably some specific parameters with the definitions of portfolios still to be tweaked and worked on and iterated through. So today we're really focusing on kind of proof of concept on a subset of these results to sort of show that ROSI, our capacity expansion model, is working as expected, is sort of receiving the inputs that we're giving it in terms of conducting some different resource tests and producing results that make sense with what we're trying to do. And then also start to take an initial look at some of the scoring metrics that Nahit described in his section just a few minutes ago, those traditional cost and risk metrics, to start to see what we can glean from these initial results. Next slide, please. Next, please. Okay, so just a quick review of some some key terms that we use when we're talking about portfolio analysis. A portfolio itself is a fixed set of resource decisions set in all scenarios. The model ROSI creates a resource build around these choices. We will show a set of defined portfolios here in a few minutes. This is distinct from scenarios, which refer to the elements that are varied within portfolio analysis, resulting in multiple resource build-outs for each portfolio. Some of the predefined scenarios that we have embedded in the modeling are need futures, technology cost futures, price futures, and hydro futures. When we talk about a resource build-out, that's the least cost set of incremental resource additions given a set of specific input conditions, such as a portfolio and scenario. So a resource build-out can vary by portfolio, and within a portfolio can vary by scenario. And then sensitivities. We're not going to be presenting any sensitivity results today. We'll be focusing just on portfolios, but eventually when we get around to running these sensitivities, they test the robustness or provide additional information on the preferred portfolio. So sensitivities will be run once we've selected a preferred portfolio, and then we'll force changes to resource constraints or other inputs to see how that impacts the resource build or scoring metrics associated with the preferred portfolio. Next slide. Just briefly, a review of some of the design principles used in constructing portfolios. They're all designed to meet a set of constraints. All portfolios need to meet our resource needs, so our capacity needs, and our energy need defined by our energy position. There are other portfolio constraints that must be met, such as having a defined greenhouse gas emissions reduction glide path, as has been presented and discussed in previous roundtables, and so we include having to comply with those constraints in the model. Other examples are forcing in different levels of CBREs, ensuring a specific amount of CBREs are selected, or in one portfolio, constraining the model to only select Oregon resources, for example. And then there's other types of policy constraints that we include in the model, such as not allowing the model to go overly long in its resource build and build way more energy than we need. So portfolios cannot, in the long run, cannot be over 100 average megawatts in any given year. And then we also enforce renewable portfolio standard constraints, although those are no longer really the binding constraint or driving constraint for resource needs, given now the much stricter constraints associated with greenhouse gas emissions reductions. Next slide, please. Okay, so thank you. Yeah, just a quick review of, oh yeah, the next slide works. Thank you. So a quick review of some of the current data vintages that we're using that went into the creation, the modeling of these results. So for capacity and energy position, I'll be showing a couple subsequent slides that show the inputs that we used for that. The load forecast, we use draft analysis that incorporates the March 2022 load forecast that was shared in the April roundtable. DER inputs, we use draft analysis that incorporates DER outputs from the 2022 DSP and Energy Trust's forecast, which was shared in the July roundtable and the November roundtable. We incorporated results of a market capacity study that was shared in July and updated in October. We have final VER integration costs and flexibility values for dispatchable resources that were shared in October's roundtable. Our cost and performance data of new resources, proxy resources, incorporates cost and performance data for the reference low and high technology cost features that includes an update for the Inflation Reduction Act tax credits being incorporated. And then accounting for the outcome of the 2021 RFP, draft analysis incorporates the Clearwater Wind Project and proxy resources to represent the rest of the outcome of the 2021 RFP. And I see we have a hand up.
Thank you. Kim, that's your hand, I believe. Would you like to go?
Yeah, thanks. Can you just say a little bit more about what was included from the 2021 RFP? And because my understanding is the Clearwater Wind Project is one of the selected projects from that, but that we don't have the others yet. So how did you handle that?
Yeah, so that
will it represent, final decisions, or is the timing not right for that?
Yeah, so the rest of what's being added to account for resources that we expect to be added as a result of the RFP are being added as a like a proxy form at this point. I believe that it's a certain amount of solar and storage. I believe those, I guess, in the way the models work, those aren't sort of added explicitly directly into ROSI. They're added into upstream models like Sequoia and Aurora. So then that data that flows from those models into ROSI incorporate those being included. So I don't know those numbers off the top of my head of what the exact mix is because I don't work with those specific numbers, putting them into ROSI. I know Tomas could provide those numbers either now or in a follow-up afterward.
Hey, this is Tomas, and we can likely provide you the exact numbers in a follow-up, but the general idea is, in order to use broad strokes here, the RFP was roughly targeting around 380 megawatts of capacity. And I want to say 200 and some average megawatts of energy. So the added resources that in aggregate provide that level. It's mostly an even split between wind and solar, with batteries making up the capacity component. But again, we can get to more specifics later.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, do we have time? I think we have time. Jake, would you like to go?
Yes, thanks. I guess question kind of more about, I think the slide, I mean, you fed from the portfolio design principles, and it kind of feeds into this. The policy constraints about not being long over 100 megawatts average. And how are you guys looking at the, dealing with the delays and also kind of your market procurement competition situation, which has changed a lot? I mean, effectively, it feels like some failure and delay rates need to be incorporated into the procurement targets, and wondering how that's dealt with. Like, obviously, you need something that's realistic and some sort of offsetting thing there. And I don't know if there's a broader policy discussion PUC relative to that, but given that all interconnections are slow and delayed and so forth, it seems like there needs to be some sort of contingency to ensure both the reliability issues and so forth, but also the regulatory decarbonization compliance. Where is that 100 megawatts coming from? And that just may not be realistic in terms of what your targets need to be. So talk a little bit about that.
I guess I'm not sure I'm completely following the relationship between that particular constraint and procurement risk. Are you suggesting that we might need to build?
You are going to have
earlier
delays.
and faster.
Projects are going to fail. Bonneville is going to be late. Transmission is going to be late. So I think how is PGE going to mitigate that risk in its procurement plans relative to that's not speculative. That's very, very likely. And it seems like the 100 megawatt average policy constraint might be in tension with that, or if the model is approaching it that way. Like, you know, if you plan on everything being procured or disproportionately showing up in 2029, but to meet 2030, but all of that stuff is, you know, a quarter of it's 3 years late, a quarter of it's 2 years late, a quarter of it's 1 year late, and a quarter of it's on time. You can't reach your compliance successfully, but that's an anticipatable and sort of known, highly probable situation. For example, I'm overlaying that on 2030 for the cleanness of the comparison, but it's a near-term problem. And from our view, you have a real compliance risk related to data centers competing with you for supply. And so your ability to mitigate risk and compliance also essentially requires competing earlier, sooner, to make sure you don't end up behind later. Thus, that seems like a key area and maybe failure probability area.
Thanks, Jake. Yeah, I can jump in to try and excuse me, take some of that. So to clarify, the 100 average megawatt constraint is to prevent the model from going to excessively long. That's a subjective statement, excessively, but we had a lot of pushback from participants in the last IRPs for going and procuring resources ahead of need. And so we're trying to balance that on a modeling perspective as best as we can. And so again, that's a subjective constraint, but that is the energy limitation above. And what that really does is it is a constraint that affects the relative capacity saturation, because you need the resources. And so that forces you to build more capacity resources rather than getting capacity light resources, such as a VAR with a smaller amount of capacity contribution. If you can't go that long on the energy side, then you have to build some more density. In terms of the procurement risk, those are real. And as of now, we don't have that built. We do have some ideas about sensitivities that we want to do. We're not going to present results on that today. If you have ideas for suggestions as to what those analyses would look like, please do let us know. Just like follow up with us in via email, I think is the best way. But we're very open to ideas there. And I'm gonna push any further conversation about that or the energy constraint assumption to the end, unless there are other clarifying questions.
That's helpful. I think there's a lot of permissivity in the statute for the rapid reduction and continual progress that be worth thinking about in that regard. Thanks.
Okay, thanks for the question, and thanks, Seth. I think with that, we can move to the next slide. Okay, so here we have a graph of the draft capacity needs that were used in portfolio modeling to produce these results. We have showing from 2025 out through 2043 through the end of the modeling time horizon. We can see that we have a jump in capacity need in 2026 and then again in 2040. So what we're seeing is capacity needs of 820 megawatts in summer and 762 megawatts in winter in 2026. With that jump there happening mainly due to expiration of number of contracts. And then with the next big jump in 2040, taking us up to 1,162 megawatts in summer and 1,062 megawatts in winter, with that jump being driven primarily by contract expiration or not contract expiration, but I guess losing the ability to utilize thermal units, as Tomas discussed in more detail earlier in the presentation. Okay, next slide, please. Yeah, here we have a graph showing our draft energy position from 2023 through 2043. The graph shows the different sources of energy that we have to serve retail load, and 3 different projections of load, low need future, reference need future, and high need future. All of the results that we'll be presenting here are with regards to the reference need future. So we can see that out through 2026, we are long in energy, and beginning in 2027, we have less energy than we need to serve load. With this trend, this downward trend in energy availability being driven by HB 2021 greenhouse gas emissions targets, and so we see a big reduction in our energy from emitting sources, which includes our own thermals and also energy from unspecified sources or specified sources with a known carbon content or greenhouse gas content. And with these results being specific to the linear greenhouse gas reduction glide path, and being for the RNRR price future case. Next slide, please. Okay, so some key assumptions that are being used in portfolio analysis, which are essentially our default assumptions that go into every portfolio unless they're modified by the specific design of any given portfolio. For emissions, we have the linear decline associated with meeting 80% reduction by 2030, and then another linear decline from 2031 to 2035, and then again linear from 2036 to 2040. Resources are available for selection starting in 2026. Transmission availability in our default set of assumptions, the South of Alston expansion becomes available in 2027, opening up to 400 additional megawatts of access to our traditional set of proxy resources. The transmission expansion options to Wyoming and the Desert Southwest are only available after other resources that we have transmission to is exhausted. So those come in 2031, their availability in the default. And then every portfolio includes 200 megawatts of capacity and energy associated with, or 200 megawatts of capacity and an associated amount of energy associated with the contract that is available through 2030. And in the default, we assume that, we force into the model 100% of the available capacity of CBREs. Next slide, please. Okay, so reviewing from November's presentation, the specific sets of portfolios that we have them broken into categories. The first category is called customer portfolios. They're portfolios that include a defined set of customer actions. We have the CBRE optimized portfolio that does not force in the 100% of the CBREs. Instead, it allows Rosie to optimize and select as much as is economic. We have CBRE microgrid where the model must select 100% of the microgrid potential and does not select any of the other CBREs. We have CBRE 75%, where we force in 75% of the total potential of the CBREs. Then we have 3 portfolios. One more CBRE portfolio where we CBRE 0. We assume no CBREs are available. And then we have 2 energy efficiency, non-cost effective energy efficiency and DERs portfolios, where in the default, the model has access to the full amount of their potential. And then we have a no non-cost effective EE and DERs portfolio that assumes none of that amount is available. And then we have a 30 average megawatt version of the portfolio, where the model must select 30 average megawatts of additional EE, which is less than having access to the full amount in the default. We also have some targeted policy portfolios that limit portfolio options to meet a targeted policy direction. One is Oregon resources only. The model can only select Oregon-sited resources. And then a physical RPS, renewable portfolio standard portfolio that enforces a physical RPS compliance constraint. Next slide, please. We have a group of emerging technology portfolios that require the adoption of a specific emerging or long lead time technology. So we have 2 hydrogen portfolios. The first one assumes a natural gas plant conversion. So existing natural gas plants, BGE gas plants, being converted to use a blend of hydrogen fuel. The second hydrogen portfolio assumes a 100 megawatts of a new 100% hydrogen powered plant to be built in 2028. Offshore wind, or I guess not to be built, to be available in 2028. An offshore wind portfolio that assumes 500 megawatts of offshore wind as forced into the portfolio in 2032. Pumped hydro forces in 333 megawatts of pumped hydro storage in 2028. And a long duration portfolio forces in 139 megawatts of 24-hour battery in 2028, which is an equivalent amount of energy storage as is available in the pumped hydro portfolio. And that's those 2 are, the numbers are updated from what we presented last time.
Rob, can I interrupt you and ask a question that came in the chat?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, I'm gonna read it to you. It's from Jeff Larson with Apex. Please explain the difference between the Desert Southwest and Wyoming proxy resource assumption of 400 megawatts available in 2026 and the unconstrained assumption in 2031. Where does the 400 megawatt come from if you're missing a transmission build option? Either the line is built or it is not. So how do you get incremental capacity early?
Well, okay, good question. The difference between the portfolios, I guess, is in the default, they become available in 2031, and in the resource specific portfolios, they were forcing in 400 megawatts of that resource in 2026. So in those specific portfolios, yeah, you're getting the full chunk of 400 all at once, and you still have the option to add incremental amounts. And in the default, yeah, you can the model can build incremental amounts. That's maybe a modeling simplification in some ways, because yeah, you're not building a transmission line 1 megawatt at a time, but it also, there are also some advantages to modeling it that way, and that I guess if we can determine sort of an exact megawatt number that we're seeing is useful for the system, and that might not match the realities of construction of transmission lines, but it's giving us some additional information that we might not have gained if we were only looking at incremental chunks. And so it doesn't, we're not claiming that you would build a transmission line a megawatt at a time, but this way we're allowing the model to sort of do that directional analysis that we've talked about, and try to get to that number of what amount of transmission might be appropriate for our portfolio.
Okay, thanks. And then do you mind taking Jake's question? He has his hand up.
Sure.
Thanks. And before I ask, are each of these, is this like one big scenario, or are each of these going to be individually, each line item here is a separate analysis?
Yeah, each bullet point here is an individual portfolio.
Okay. I have several questions. I'll try to do quick punchy ones, but hydrogen 2, is that like a 90+% capacity factor dispatch presumed, or like this is just a dispatchable, you know, low capacity factor asset? Like, are you assuming you're going to have base load hydrogen essentially in 28?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm trying to remember off the top of my head what the capacity factor of that resource is. I know it's if I'm remembering correctly, it ends up being like more similar to like a storage type asset. So it's not base load. It's more like dispatchable capacity. I would have to follow up with you after I looked at what the exact capacity factor is. But yeah, think of it more as a like dispatchable capacity.
Yeah, thanks. So realism sort of keys off of that. Great update on the offshore wind, pump storage. I mean, I guess jumping down to those are a lot of good updates. Obviously, I appreciate that from prior comments, and I see that. And similarly, south of Alston makes total sense. I'm not sure I entirely assume how an unconstrained transmission assumption makes any sense, even as a possible scenario. If you could discuss that. And I similarly have questions about this sort of early adoption of transmission. Like, what is the specific projects? I mean, transmission being early is an oxymoron, right? So like, it seems like it'd be more appropriate to be studying it as what if it's 4 years late than 2 years early kind of thing.
Yeah, those are all good points. I guess starting with the unconstrained transmission, I think that's we've been asked to look at that in docket. I can't remember exactly. Seth would have to remind me where exactly that requirement is. 2225. So that's not something that we're viewing as like an actionable portfolio, but it's done for informational purposes. In terms of the early transmission, again, I don't think that means that we expect a brand new transmission line starting from scratch gets built by then. I think, and as was discussed in some previous versions of the sort of formulating of our thinking on transmission, that these are meant to represent like a wide range of potential transmission opportunities that could arise. And so, you know, if there was a transmission project that someone was building and we could become involved in it, or, you know, acquire a share of it, this is sort of to explore if we were presented with an opportunity early, would it potentially make sense, or how would that affect our portfolio? Not assuming that we're building a brand new transmission line from scratch by 2026.
Yeah,
And then we do have
sorry.
a portfolio where we look at delayed access, where they're just delayed by a year in this case. But again, these sort of assumptions are all draft, and there's potential for tweaking some of these things. But we have the TX risk is a portfolio that we've added since the last time these were presented, and so we're making that availability occur a year later.
Yeah, so on the transmission, it seems like PGE needs to identify that there actually is some specific project that actually exists and isn't like a hypothetical.
Hey, Jake, let me stop you right there. We've had this conversation. We've heard this comment from you, so it's well understood, well appreciated. The realism of all our supply side options needs to be, front and center in the IRP. And so again, we appreciate the comment, and we are going to include a justification in the filing of that IRP as to why these are realistic assumptions.
Isn't that what the public process for is, to identify? I mean, it seems like we keep asking and you refuse to identify that any such thing exists. If it does, it should be really easy to say, oh, it's this one, it's so-and-so's project. And
so again, these are proxy resources. They represent general characteristics of what we can expect to find in the market. We've had the conversation. We have justified why they are considered realistic. We will also provide that in the filing, and also we can follow up with individual participants as needed.
You have justified it in these meetings or somewhere else?
Yes, we've had this conversation in the past 2 IRP roundtable meetings.
The answer has always been a generic, maybe some thing exists, not here's a specific one. So
what I'm hearing from you right now is that our answer has been insufficient for you. Is that correct?
Yeah, you haven't answered it with any specific
project. We appreciate the comment. We've heard it before. We've responded to it, and we will provide information in the filing. There's nothing more we're really going to say about this topic in this roundtable today.
Next question is, so where's our distributed generation cases at scale? That's also come up quite a bit. We need 500 to 1,000 megawatt type DG and West Side cases. And
Jake, I think Seth was pretty clear that we're not going to say anything more about this. What I would encourage you to do, if you want this to be answered or to be in our queue, is to put your comments in the stakeholder feedback form, and we can read them more thoroughly there if you'd like that. I'm going to take Kim's question next, and then we're going to let Rob move on with the conversation.
Clarifying, not saying more, and while you're basically saying we're refusing to include those cases, there are different things. So that's what I hear, is you guys are refusing to include large scale distributed generation, as has been brought up by stakeholders.
Yep, we heard you. That makes sense that you heard that. Kim, go ahead.
Thanks. I'm curious about the transmission risk, the delays to transmission upgrades, and maybe also this goes to the South of Alston upgrade. Do these align necessarily with the BPA related PGE upgrades from the TSEP process? Like, does it? I guess I'm wondering whether those like really specifically identified upgrade needs are captured at all in any of these portfolios.
It's a good question. And no, none of these are tied specifically to upgrades that were identified by BPA in their TSEPs.
Okay, I guess I just wondered what, I would be curious to see whether there's a way to have that reflected. So anyway, just that feedback.
Yeah, that's a good idea. Thanks for the suggestion, and we'll talk about it. Think about if we might be able to include something like that. Okay, I think I maybe never explicitly worked my way through the transmission portfolios, but we pretty much ended up describing them all through the discussion just now, with the exception of the RTO portfolio, which tests the impact of potentially joining a regional RA program, which ends up in the modeling being reflected as a reduction in our capacity need. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so for our last couple groups of portfolios here, we have the optimized group that is run with the default assumptions, with the exception that in the default models, in the default setting, portfolios are optimized subject to minimizing long-term NPVRR throughout the entire planning horizon, and these alternative optimization portfolios look at optimizing for a different objective function. So we have minimizing short-term costs through 2030, minimizing long-term costs throughout the planning horizon, and then minimizing reference case only through the short term. We also have accelerated decarbonization portfolios that test different greenhouse gas glide paths for emissions reductions. Like I said, the default assumption is using the linear glide path, and then we have alternatives. So GHG1 achieves carbon targets 2 years ahead of schedule. GHG2 achieves 100% carbon reduction by 2035. GHG3 meets 2030 targets by front loading the emissions reduction, so reducing faster in earlier years. And then GHG4 rear loads the path to 2030, sort of pushing out the emissions reductions closer to 2030. Next slide, please. So for today's presentation, we don't have results for all of the portfolios. We have results for all 6 of the customer portfolios, 4 of the 5 emerging technology portfolios, and all 6 of the transmission portfolios. In subsequent roundtable meetings, we'll be presenting the results for the other portfolios that are not included today, including 1 of the emerging technology portfolios, the 4 accelerated decarbonization portfolios, the 3 targeted policy portfolios, and the 3 optimized portfolios. Next slide, please. Okay, so now we'll get into taking the first look at some of the actual results.
Hey, Rob, before we do, if I could jump in. So for those of you all who are following along with the slides that were sent out, you may see some small discrepancies between what's on the screen here and what's in your, what was in the email that I just sent out. They're just tiny errors corrected. We had a units issue on the y-axis of some graphs. It just, we were making edits pretty, not too long ago. So the source of truth is this truth with heavy quotation marks is this deck right now, and these are the slides that will be posted on the website. So just understand that there might be some discrepancies, but those will be ironed out fairly shortly.
Thanks for the clarification there, Seth. Okay, next slide, please. So yeah, first we'll take a look at results for some of the customer portfolios. Next slide. And we've broken them into the non-cost effective EE and DER portfolios that were shown here, and then we'll show the CBRE portfolios separately. So these portfolios test varying actions across the amounts of non-cost effective EE and DR in the model. want to be clear that all cost-effective energy efficiency and DERs are embedded in the load forecast that we use. And so here we're just looking at the potential for adding additional amounts above that. So amounts of EE and DER that are not traditionally considered cost effective, but we're comparing them against supply side resources. So we have a graph here that shows the cumulative resource additions for each of these three portfolios in the years 2026, 2027, and 2028. All of the portfolios have contract extension 200 megawatts on the bottom, and you'll see that in all the portfolios we present. And then these, you have the turquoise color CBREs, purple EE and DR is what we're going to be keeping an eye out for in these graphs. Green is storage, orange is hybrids, yellow, we're not seeing any of that in these graphs, but yellow is solar, blue is wind, and then we have the patterned bar portions that represent the transmission upgrades or expansion portions. I see a hand up.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
had a question about the modeling of cost-effective versus non-cost-effective EE and DR. Why are they being treated differently? Why are you also not considering cost-effective as a competitive resource?
Yeah, it's a good question. I guess it's the cost effective is all already assumed to be being acquired and is just embedded as a reduction in load. So we can't really include that here because we'd be double counting it. So we're assuming we're taking all of that at a minimum. And then here we're looking at, would we potentially add more beyond that? Does that answer your question?
But yeah, but the future cost-effective EE and DR have not been acquired already, right?
Yeah, that's correct. So it's just taken straight out of the load forecast. So just demand is lower because of those resources. We could incorporate that quantity into this figure going forward if that's helpful to highlight that it is a resource. It is in our modeling, it is the most competitive of resources because we are just assuming it shows up. And those forecasts come from the ETO and our DSP team.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Seth. Okay, so the specific portfolios themselves, on the left, we have a portfolio with just our default assumption for non-cost effective EE and DERs where the full amount is available for selection, and you can see that it is being selected. Some amount is being selected there in purple. When you move to the middle where none is made available, you can see that no purple is showing up, which is what we're going for with that portfolio. And then with the 30 average megawatts on the right, in that portfolio, we have, it's a little hard to tell with the scale here, but we have an amount that is more than zero and less than the amount being selected in the default. So next slide, please.
Before you move on, can I read a question in the chat? I think
sure.
I'm pretty sure it's a clarifying question you can handle.
Okay.
So it's from Jeff Larson from Apex. Please explain what you are assuming in the hybrid category. Is it solar and storage? And if so, what is the size of the storage, the solar relatives to storage, and what is the storage assumption? Like, for example, 4-hour or 6-hour?
Yeah, let's see. It's a good question. We have a few different hybrids. So these graphs are all aggregating a number of specific proxy resources into their more broad resource categories. For hybrids, we have, I guess, 2 different configurations, each available in 2 different locations. So we have a Christmas Valley solar plus storage of 2 different configurations, and then a McMinnville solar plus storage of 2 different configurations. And I think it's, if I'm remembering correctly, we have a 1-to-1 solar to battery ratio and a 2-to-1 solar to battery ratio. And I think that it is a 4-hour battery that is associated with the hybrid facility.
Yeah, I would add to that answer that we've done a lot of work on the characterization of hybrid resources. There are infinite number of ways you can configure the resource. And so we'll follow up with you with the links and times to the presentations where we've discussed that and the exact specifications. So the bottom line is that there are infinite number of ways you can configure this. We tried to take, again, with our proxy supply side resource options, we're trying to get general characteristics rather than project specifics out there. So we will follow up with you on those assumptions in the model right now.
Thanks, Seth.
I'm going to do a time check here because we're, Rob, I know you have quite a few slides to get through, and we have about 10 more minutes left in our planned meeting time. So I would like it if we could move through the slides a little bit and maybe take questions that we can at the end of it.
Can I
Yeah, that
ask
sounds
a
good.
quick clarifying question on this slide?
I'm sorry, say that again.
I have a quick clarifying question on this slide. I just want to understand how it relates to the transmission constraints in terms of what's being considered here. Is transmission constrained as you're looking at these selections, or is it wide open because the selection is obviously pretty different?
Yes, yeah. So in the default transmission assumption for us, which is in place for all portfolios other than sort of ones where we're doing specific looks at transmission, these all include the constraint that we've discussed in the past about the BPA inventory availability. So these are subject to those.
I have a quick clarifying question on those purple bands in the first and third groups. In the third group, it says it picks 30. How much is it picking in the first group?
That's a great question, and it's some amount more than 30.
How's it decide?
It decides based on sort of the optimization of the resource needs that we have for capacity and energy, and then looking at the amount of capacity and energy that the EE or the DR products provide relative to the other resources that are available, and it chooses the least cost way to satisfy those needs that the system has. I would have to pull up a workbook with lots of numbers in it to remember the specific numbers for the build that's happening in the graph, the portfolio on the left here. Be happy to follow up if you want to see them.
Does this mean that non-cost effective resources became cost effective in this analysis?
That is what we're seeing. So yeah, these are draft results, and actually the next slide helps illustrate this point a little bit more as well. But yeah, given this set of assumptions that we've used here, when you give the model access to these non-cost effective resources, it is selecting some amount of them. So it means that they're showing to be cost effective in this case up to a certain amount. And so actually on these graphs here, where we have the three cost and risk metrics that Nahit described in the last section, where we have reference case NPVRR on the top, variability in the middle, and severity down on the bottom. We can see that in the default, where the model has the access to the largest amount of EE and DER resources, we have the lowest costs. When you move to the middle and you don't give the model access to those resources at all, the NPVRR goes up and is the highest out of these three portfolios. And when you look at the one all the way on the right, that is sort of the middle amount of resource, you get an NPVRR in the middle. So these results sort of make sense or logical to us when you give it the model more options. It's going to be able to find a lower cost solution to the problem. And so, yeah, there are still some aspects of characterizing these resources that are in progress in terms of developing future cost trajectories and some things like that we're still tuning the dials on. One of the impacts of that is you can see the variability here. The variability of these portfolios are comparable to one another, but at this point, they're not really comparable to other portfolios because the current cost trajectories we have don't vary across high, low, and reference. They're cost features like the other resources do. So we just have a single set of cost trajectories for these. So as a result, there's less variability in the outcomes. So we have the severity metric down at the bottom as well, which is we're not going to really focus on that. That's one of our traditional metrics that we'll be using, summarizing, and presenting for all portfolios, but it really tends to follow and track NPVRR. And so we can just look at the NPVRR relationships, and that is going to tell us pretty much everything we would get from making the comparisons on the severity as well. Okay, so next slide, please. So here we have the CBRE portfolios where we test different amounts of availability of CBREs. On the left, we have the CBRE optimize portfolio. Actually, let's start one in from the left. CBRE 100%. That's the default assumption of what's going into all portfolios when we're not explicitly changing that. So we have CBREs being forced in at 100%. You can see that turquoise color near the bottom of the resource stack there. If you move all the way over to the left, we have the CBRE optimized, where the model has access to the full amount, but we're not forcing it in. You can see in those bar charts that we do have some amount of the turquoise resource showing up. So the model is selecting some amount less than the full amount, but some amount of the CBREs, even when it's not being forced to, which is an interesting finding at this point. We could talk more about that when we get to the cost metrics. Then when we move to the middle, CBRE 75%. We have, a sort of intermediate amount of CBREs being added. You can see that in the turquoise. CBRE 0. there's no turquoise. So sort of where the model's doing what we want, where the model's doing what we want. The test that we're trying to achieve here by not including any is showing up there. And then CBRE microgrid, where we just add the microgrid, we can see that there's some amount of that showing up there. So the next slide, please.
Hey, Rob, I'm going to interrupt you just for a quick housekeeping item.
Okay.
Okay. So I know that we're at time right now. We're gonna keep going. This meeting's being recorded. And if you do have to leave, but you want to get more of this information, the recording will be on our website and available for you to watch and catch up with this later. So I know we want to be respectful of your time. So please do leave if you need to, and all of this recording will be available. And Rob, if you just keep going, we'll get through the presentation and then take questions.
Okay, thanks, Jesse. Next slide, please. Okay, so taking a quick look at these initial cost results for these CBRE portfolios. We can see that the CBRE optimized portfolio has the lowest cost, which is as you would expect, because you're not putting another constraint on the model. It's having its additional choices to make, and that allows it to find a lower cost future than when you're putting extra constraints on it. But it is picking some amount of CBREs, which is offsetting some amount of traditional supply side VER resources. And so that's a result that's a really interesting result, one that we're going to have to dig into a little more. Curious, how we're finding that they're cost competitive. If this result holds, that's an interesting and important result. As of right now, it could be that the RCBI, as described by Nahit previously, is adding enough extra value to it that it makes it competitive. It's also possible that there's a bit of sort of capacity shopping going on, where as other traditional supply side resources sort of move down their ELCC curve and provide less capacity as more quantity of those resources is added, that then sort of bouncing back to pick the first unit of a CBRE that's at higher ELCC, at higher point on the curve, makes sense. So yeah, there's still a lot to explore with what's going on with these results, and so we're going to sort of keep iterating on these and looking at them, and we'll be updating these in future roundtables. Next slide, please. Okay, so now we'll look at the emerging technology portfolios. Next slide. So here we can see the resource builds 2026 through 2028 for the hydrogen 2 portfolio, which is the one that forces in a 100 megawatt dedicated hydrogen plant. We're not showing the results for the hydrogen blending portfolio yet. We're still working out the assumptions that go into that one. We'll have that next time we present results. So you can see in the hydrogen 2 portfolio up there near the top of the stack, we've got the red bar of 100 megawatts of hydrogen showing up in 2028. Offshore wind is a little bit difficult to show in this chart because offshore wind is not expected to be available in this time period that we're showing in these results. However, in the full results, each of these portfolios has results out through 2043. And so in later in the resource build, there's 500 megawatts of offshore wind going in, You're not seeing that in these results in terms of the megawatts right now, but the NPVRR values, which are calculated over the entire time horizon, are influenced by that. And so it is accounted for in the results in the next slide. In the long duration storage portfolio, that is being added in 2028. I probably should have broken out the specific storage categories here so you could see it. And right now it's just being accounted for as storage. And so you can see that that's green storage bar, if you squint and look real closely, is bigger in that one than in the offshore wind and hydrogen. And so that's where the long duration storage is being added. Similarly with pumped hydro, that's showing up in that green storage bar being added in 2028. Next slide, please. So not going to really take too much time looking at the cost results here. These portfolios are interesting, an interesting way to look at these emerging technologies. There's also just a lot of uncertainty in the inputs associated with trying to model these things with the cost inputs and the performance characteristics of these resources that we don't have just a ton of confidence in what these numbers are going to be out in the future. And so in the IRP, we're doing this analysis and we're hoping to glean some information out of it, but we're really focusing more on our post 2030 analysis of a more qualitative sort of deep dive review that we've taken of a number of different resources that we think in the post 2030 timeframe will be necessary for us to meet our goals, but we don't know, which one's going to emerge yet. And so we've explored many of the key aspects and are going to include a good write-up of that in IRP, but we're not going to focus so much on these results here. So with that, I'll move on to the next slide and get into our last set of results, which is the transmission portfolios. So here we're presenting some portfolios that evaluate different transmission assumptions and conditions and constraints. And so starting all the way on the left, we have the completely unconstrained transmission portfolio, which is just assuming that there's we don't have those BPA inventory constraints, and we can access all of our traditional set of proxy resources up to any amount that we need. Like I mentioned before, that's not a portfolio that we consider to be actionable, but you can see it for reference, what things might look like if we didn't have constrained transmission. When you just tying the bow on that one, if you don't have constrained transmission, the model will tend to go for more VER resources and move away from, to some degree, some of the storage instead, because it's able to access more VERs. Moving to the right one, we have the South of Alston upgrade portfolio, where we are forcing in a 400 megawatt upgrade at South of Alston in 2027. And you can see that showing up at the top of the bars there in 2027, which is, it's showing up as kind of in the same bars as actual resource builds, but just want to clarify that that's not 400 megawatts of a resource build itself. That's enabling access to 400 megawatts of other resources, and then those are showing up in the renewable bars in the form of hybrids and wind. Then we have the the Desert Southwest transmission and the Wyoming transmission portfolios in the middle. You can see that Desert Southwest, we're adding 400 megawatts in 2026 of market access, which is the sort of polka dotted top bit of the bar there. And that represents the 400 megawatts of transmission expansion, and then an associated 400 megawatts of solar being added with it. And then similarly in the Wyoming portfolio, we have kind of the same thing going on, but with adding the Wyoming wind along with the transmission. You'll notice that these resource builds are a lot smaller than the other ones being shown here. And that's going on for a couple of reasons. The first part being that we're forcing in 400 megawatts of this resource in 2026. In 2026, that's when we have a jump in capacity need. Other resources or other portfolios are building a lot of storage to handle that need in 2026. When you give it 400 megawatts of perfect capacity transmission and associated resources in 2026, it doesn't need to build nearly as much. Then moving on to the right, we have the RTO portfolio, which just has a lower capacity need, 200 megawatts lower of capacity need. And then the transmission risk portfolio all the way on the right, which has sort of the similar thing that was going on with offshore wind, where you're not really seeing the impacts in the build here because it's taking place, the changes, the test that we're doing is taking place outside of these 3 years. So TX risk is pushing out the availability of the Desert Southwest and Wyoming transmission to 2032. And so that shows up in cost metrics, but not in the resource build here. Okay, so next slide, please. So yeah, here we have the cost and risk metrics associated with the portfolios. You can see that the unconstrained transmission portfolio has by far the lowest costs, which makes sense because you're removing a big constraint. So the model's going to have an easier time finding a lower cost way to solve. And then the next cheapest ones are, I believe, the two transmission expansion portfolios. And they also have lower variability associated with them as well. So again, just based on our sort of initial attempt at characterizing these portfolios and modeling them, this is the results we're seeing, and we're going to continue to be iterating through some of these assumptions, I'm sure, and be coming back with a more refined set of results in the next meeting. And so with that, I think next slide, please.
Rob, we've got a question right now.
Okay.
Rob, could you go back to 74 for a minute? This is a general question on all these slides that look kind of like this. I'm not sure what the megawatts on the left axis is representing. And because of that, I don't know why these different groups of analysis reach different heights.
Yeah, that's a good question. So the megawatts on the vertical axis is the total nameplate build of resources that are occurring in the model in order to meet our resource needs. And so they're cumulative amounts. So that's why you see that they're always bigger in later years. So this is the cumulative amount that's been added through the year that you're seeing. And the reason that we're seeing different quantities added in different portfolios is largely due to the fact that different portfolios have access to a different set of resources that have different characteristics and qualities, and that changes the amount of resources that you need in total to meet the requirements of the system. So the sort of really good example here is looking at the Desert Southwest and Wyoming transmission portfolios, and those transmission resources are very capacity dense. They have a 100% ELCC, and so when you have access to them, and when you have access to them early, especially, you don't need to build nearly so many nameplate megawatts of resources, because you're sort of building a denser resource that can meet your needs with fewer nameplate megawatts.
Thank you. So what you're saying, I believe, is that all of these make the same amount of power for the customer, but they have to have different nameplates to get there.
That's generally true. They all, for the most part, they're designed to meet the same requirements for capacity and energy. It's a good specific clarification for the Desert Southwest and Wyoming transmission that when we force that amount in 2026, that we're sort of probably forcing in a little bit more energy than you would otherwise have. So in some of these cases where we like force a certain amount in, then you might end up with some more energy than the model would select as strictly needing. But generally otherwise, if you're not forcing in something and you're just allowing access to different amounts of things, you'll end up with the same amount of energy for the customer.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thanks for the question.
Hi, I can't recall, did you already go over the transmission risk portfolio? Just maybe I'm forgetting how you are, like how the transmission risk is being captured there.
Yeah, transmission risk currently is just it's a pushing back of the timing of the availability of the Desert Southwest and Wyoming transmission proxies, and so in this portfolio they're available starting in 2022. So it's just looking at the risk of later availability of those two resources.
Rob, did you have another slide to finish up on this section?
Yeah, I think I have one more slide at the end that we could probably move to. And this is just sort of where we're going with this. Like I said, these are all draft results, and so now we've got the next steps of sort of continuing to develop the remaining portfolios that we haven't presented here in terms of the targeted policy portfolios, the optimized portfolios, the remaining hydrogen portfolio that we didn't present, and the greenhouse gas pathway portfolios, and then sort of updating and iterating with updates to assumptions, constraints, and input data. And yeah, we'll be working on that and then coming back with new results to share next time.
Okay.
And I believe that's it for me. That's the last
Great.
slide, I think.
Thanks. Shadia, could you move to the next step slide, actually? Okay. I really want to express our appreciation for a lot of you who've stayed the extra 20 minutes. I have kept track of all the questions that I've received in the chat directly to me. And so either we'll reach out or we'll cover those questions in a follow-up roundtable. For today's recording, it'll be on our website in about a week. And then our next roundtable is January 26th. Next slide. And that's it from us today. If you have questions you didn't get a chance to ask, please use our email, or online is our feedback form, and you can send questions that way as well. So have a great day.